You've been abandoning yourself for so long that it may have started to feel normal, saying yes when your heart means no, staying where you are wounded, calling self-neglect patience, calling silence peace, calling exhaustion strength. But if abandoning yourself were the way to be loved, the way to be whole, the way to finally feel enough, then why does it leave such a deep ache inside? Why do so many people keep giving everything and still feel empty, unseen, and unworthy? The truth is, healing does not begin when the world changes or when other people finally choose you. Healing starts the moment you stop abandoning yourself. Buddhist teachings have pointed to this truth for centuries. The moment you return to your own pain with compassion, your own truth with honesty, and your own life with awareness, something begins to soften, something begins to heal. Tonight, as you listen, your mind may grow quieter, your heart may feel less rejected by its own silence, and the part of you that has been waiting so long to be seen may finally feel safe enough to come forward. This is not just a message about self-worth. This is the beginning of returning to yourself. Are you ready? Let us begin. Now something shifts. Because once you hear that healing begins when you stop abandoning yourself, a quiet question starts to rise. Not about the world, not about other people, but about you. Where have you been leaving yourself behind without even noticing? It does not always show up in obvious ways. It hides in habits that feel normal, in choices that seem harmless, in moments that pass so quickly you barely register them. And yet, these small moments carry weight. They shape how you feel, how you think, and how deeply you trust yourself. So before anything can truly change, there is something you have to see clearly. Not with judgment, not with blame, but with honesty. Because the truth is, the most painful form of abandonment is rarely loud. It is quiet, consistent, and deeply personal. And once you begin to notice it, you cannot unsee it. Let's step into that awareness. There is a kind of harm that does not leave bruises, does not raise voices, and does not make a scene, yet it shapes the entire direction of a life. It is the quiet violence of self-betrayal, and it happens in moments so small that they often go unnoticed. It happens when a feeling rises inside and is immediately dismissed, when a need appears and is quietly ignored, when a truth becomes clear and is gently pushed aside to keep things comfortable. At first, it feels harmless, even responsible. It can feel like maturity, like being easy to deal with, like being someone who does not cause problems. But over time, these small acts begin to add up. Each one sends a subtle message inward, a message that says your inner world is not important enough to be honored. This is how distance from the self begins, not through one big decision, but through 1,000 small ones. Consider the moments when something does not feel right, but you stay anyway. The body tightens, the mind hesitates, there is a quiet discomfort that asks to be acknowledged. Yet instead of listening, there is a quick override. A thought appears that says it is not worth making a fuss. It is easier to go along. It will pass. And so it is ignored. That moment may seem insignificant, but something inside notices. Something inside keeps a record. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar. It becomes automatic. The inner voice begins to speak more softly because it has learned that it will not be heard. The signals become weaker, not because they are no longer there, but because they have been consistently overlooked. This is where the real damage begins, because self-trust is built in moments like these. It is built when the inner voice is heard and respected, and it is broken when that voice is ignored. Every time you turn away from what you truly feel, you step a little further away from yourself. Every time you choose comfort over truth, you reinforce a pattern that says your authenticity is less important than approval or ease. And the result is subtle but powerful. You begin to feel uncertain about your own perceptions, You second-guess your instincts. You look outside yourself for guidance because inside no longer feels reliable. It is not that your inner wisdom disappeared. It is that it was gradually silenced. This is why many people feel disconnected without knowing why. There is a sense of being out of alignment, a quiet tension that lingers beneath the surface. Life may look fine from the outside, but inside there is a feeling that something is off. That feeling is not random. It is the echo of all the times you left yourself behind. The mind often tries to justify these moments. It creates reasons that make the choice seem logical. It says it is better to keep the peace, better to avoid conflict, better to be understanding. And while these reasons can sound wise, they often hide a deeper truth. Peace that requires self-betrayal is not real peace. It is suppression. Avoiding conflict by abandoning your truth does not create harmony. It creates distance. Being understanding at the cost of your own needs does not make you compassionate. It makes you invisible to yourself. The body, however, does not accept these justifications. It holds the truth in a different way. It tightens when something is wrong. It feels heavy when something is ignored. It becomes restless when something is unresolved. This is why learning to listen to the body is essential, because the body does not lie. It speaks in sensations rather than words. A slight tension in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a subtle resistance that appears without explanation. These are not random signals, they are messages. And when these messages are consistently ignored, the body begins to speak louder. It may show up as chronic stress, as fatigue that does not go away, as a constant sense of unease. It may even manifest as physical discomfort that has no clear cause. This is not punishment, it is communication. It is the body asking to be heard in a language that cannot be easily dismissed. But most people have been taught to override these signals, to push through discomfort, to ignore fatigue, to silence emotional reactions. This conditioning begins early and becomes deeply ingrained. The result is a life lived in constant override. You keep going even when you need rest. You keep giving even when you feel empty. You keep agreeing even when something inside resists. And because this pattern is so common, it rarely gets questioned. It is seen as normal. But normal does not mean healthy. In Buddhist understanding, awareness is the first step toward freedom. Not the kind of awareness that analyzes and judges, but the kind that simply observes. When you begin to observe your own patterns, without immediately trying to change them, something important happens. You start to see clearly. You notice the moments when you ignore your own needs. You notice the times when you silence your truth. You become aware of how often you leave yourself behind. And this awareness is powerful, not because it fixes everything instantly, but because it breaks the unconscious cycle. What was once automatic becomes visible. And once something is visible, it can no longer control you in the same way. This is where healing begins. Not in perfection, not in never making mistakes again, but in noticing. Noticing when you override yourself. Noticing when you stay silent instead of speaking honestly. Noticing when you choose comfort over truth. Each moment of noticing is a moment of return. It is a moment where you step back into yourself instead of away from yourself. And these moments begin to change things. At first, the change is subtle. You may pause for a second longer before responding. You may feel the discomfort more clearly instead of brushing it aside. You may begin to question choices that once felt automatic. This is progress because it means you are starting to listen. And listening is the foundation of self-respect. As this awareness deepens, something else begins to shift. You start to realize that your inner world matters, that your feelings are not inconveniences to be managed, but signals to be understood, that your needs are not burdens, but essential parts of being human. This realization can feel unfamiliar at first. even uncomfortable, because for a long time you may have been living as if your value came from how much you could ignore yourself for others. But that belief is not truth. It is conditioning. And like all conditioning, it can be seen and released. The more you honor your inner experience, the stronger your sense of self becomes. Not in a rigid or defensive way, but in a grounded and steady way. You begin to trust yourself again, not because you are always right, but because you are willing to listen. And this trust changes how you move through the world. You no longer feel the need to constantly seek validation because you are no longer disconnected from your own voice. You become less reactive because you are more in tune with what is happening inside you. You respond rather than react. You choose rather than drift. This is what it means to come back to yourself. Not to become perfect, but to become present, to be with your own experience without turning away, to stay with your truth even when it is uncomfortable. And this does not mean life becomes easy. There will still be moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments where the old patterns try to pull you back. But the difference is that now you can see them, and seeing creates space. Space to choose differently, space to pause instead of react, space to ask yourself what is actually true in that moment. This space is where freedom lives, because self-betrayal thrives in unconsciousness. It thrives in moments where there is no pause, no awareness, no questioning. But when awareness is present, the pattern begins to lose its power. You start to notice that you have a choice to listen, a choice to honor what you feel, a choice to stay with yourself instead of leaving. And each time you make that choice, something inside you strengthens, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and steadily, like a foundation being rebuilt. This is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to who you were before you learned to ignore yourself, before you learned to silence your needs, before you learned that being accepted required you to disappear. That version of you is still there, waiting, not for perfection, not for a complete transformation, but for attention, for presence, for honesty. And every time you choose to listen instead of dismiss, to feel instead of avoid, to honor instead of override, you move closer to that version. You come back. And in that return, healing begins to unfold, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a gradual shift, a softening of resistance, a quiet rebuilding of trust, a deeper connection to your own life. Because the truth is, the violence of self-betrayal is not in how dramatic it looks. It is in how consistent it is. And the healing is not in one grand decision. It is in the small moments where you choose differently, again and again, until choosing yourself no longer feels unfamiliar, until staying with your truth becomes natural, until you no longer have to remind yourself to listen, because you are already there, with yourself, fully present, no longer abandoned. Something becomes clearer now, because once you begin to notice how you have been leaving yourself in small, quiet ways, another truth slowly rises to the surface. It was never just about the moments you ignored your truth. It was also about what happened every time you felt something real and chose not to face it. And this is where the wound begins to deepen. Not when pain appears, but when pain is dismissed. So the question gently shifts. It is no longer only about where you abandoned yourself, but how often you turned away from what you were feeling in those moments. And once you begin to see this, something inside you starts asking to be heard. Not louder, but more honestly. Let's step into that awareness. There is a kind of silence that looks like strength from the outside, but feels like pressure from within. It is the silence that forms when sadness is pushed down, when anger is swallowed, when fear is quickly covered up with logic, and when exhaustion is ignored as if it were a weakness rather than a signal. This silence does not heal anything. It hides things, and what is hidden does not disappear. It waits. Many people believe that ignoring pain is a form of control. It can feel like discipline, like maturity, like emotional strength. The mind often says there is no time to sit with discomfort, no need to make a big deal out of it, no benefit in slowing down for something that feels inconvenient. But this approach comes with a cost that is rarely seen at first. Every time a feeling rises and is dismissed, a subtle message is reinforced. That message says this part of you is not valid enough to be acknowledged. It does not matter if the feeling is sadness, anger, confusion, or fear. The act of dismissing it teaches the same lesson. Over time, the inner world becomes a place where experiences are not fully allowed to exist. And this is where the wound begins to grow. Pain itself is not the problem. In Buddhist understanding, pain is part of being alive. It is natural for the mind and body to react to life. But suffering expands when there is resistance to that pain, when it is judged, rejected, or avoided. When sadness appears and is met with patience, it can move, it can shift and soften. But when sadness appears and is immediately labeled as weakness, it becomes trapped. It has nowhere to go, so it stays. And when it stays, it begins to change form. Unfelt sadness often turns into heaviness that cannot be explained. It becomes a quiet weight that follows you through the day. It shows up in moments when nothing is obviously wrong, yet something does not feel right. Anger works in a similar way. When anger is dismissed, it does not simply vanish. It goes inward. It can turn into resentment, into irritability, into a sharpness in the way you respond to small things. It is not because you are an angry person. It is because something was not allowed to be processed when it first appeared. Fear, when ignored, becomes anxiety. It becomes a constant sense of unease, a feeling that something is not safe even when there is no clear reason. The mind begins to search for explanations, creating scenarios and worries to match the unresolved feeling. Exhaustion, when dismissed, becomes burnout. The body begins to slow down, energy fades, motivation disappears. It is not laziness, it is the result of pushing beyond limits that were clearly communicated but not respected. Each of these experiences shows the same pattern. When a feeling is not acknowledged, it does not disappear. It changes shape, and the longer it is ignored, the more complex it becomes. This is why the wound deepens, not because you feel, but because you refuse to feel. The mind often plays a role in this process by minimizing what is happening. It says others have it worse, so there is no reason to complain. It says this feeling is not important enough to focus on. It says there is something wrong with you for even feeling this way. These thoughts create distance between you and your experience. Instead of meeting what is there, you begin to argue with it. You try to convince yourself that it should not exist. But feelings are not logical problems to solve. They are signals to understand. When you argue with a feeling, you are not resolving it. You are pushing it further away from awareness. And what is pushed away becomes harder to access. This is why many people reach a point where they no longer know what they feel. There is confusion, a sense of disconnection, an inability to clearly identify emotions. It is not because the emotions are gone. It is because they have been repeatedly dismissed. The inner world becomes unfamiliar. And when the inner world feels unfamiliar, it becomes difficult to trust yourself. You may begin to rely more on external validation because internal signals feel unclear. You look to others to tell you what is right, what is wrong, what you should feel, what you should do. But this dependence is not natural, it is learned. It comes from a long history of ignoring your own experience. In Buddhist practice, there is an emphasis on observing what arises without immediately reacting to it. This is not about passivity. It is about allowing experience to be seen clearly. When a feeling is allowed to be present without judgment, it begins to move on its own. It does not need to be forced. It does not need to be fixed. It simply needs to be recognized. This recognition is what interrupts the cycle of deepening the wound, because when you acknowledge what you feel, you are no longer abandoning yourself in that moment. You are staying, and staying changes everything. At first, this may feel uncomfortable, There may be a tendency to quickly distract yourself, to reach for something that takes your attention away from what is happening inside. This reaction is natural. It has been practiced for a long time. But if you pause even for a moment and allow yourself to notice what is present without trying to change it, something subtle begins to shift. The intensity of the feeling may not disappear immediately, but your relationship to it changes. It becomes something you are aware of rather than something you are fighting against. This shift reduces the pressure, because much of the suffering does not come from the feeling itself, but from the resistance to it. When resistance softens, the experience becomes more manageable. It becomes something that can be felt without overwhelming you. This is the beginning of healing, not because the pain is gone, but because it is no longer being denied. Another important aspect to understand is that dismissing inner pain often becomes a habit that operates automatically. You may not even realize it is happening. A feeling arises, and within seconds it is replaced by a thought, a distraction, or a judgment. There is no pause, no space to actually notice what occurred. This automatic response can be gently interrupted by bringing attention to the body. The body often registers emotions before the mind does. A tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a slight tension in the shoulders. These sensations are clues. They are early signals that something is present. When you learn to notice these signals without immediately trying to change them, you begin to reconnect with your internal experience. This reconnection is essential, because healing does not happen through thinking alone. It happens through feeling and understanding. It happens when the mind and body are allowed to communicate again. As this awareness develops, you may begin to notice patterns. You may see that certain situations consistently trigger certain reactions. You may realize that certain feelings are familiar, not because they are always relevant to the present moment, but because they have been carried for a long time. This insight can be uncomfortable, but it is also freeing, because it shows you that what you are experiencing is not random. There is a history behind it. And understanding that history allows you to respond differently. Instead of dismissing a feeling as irrational, you can become curious about where it comes from. Instead of judging yourself for being affected, you can recognize that there is a reason behind it. This curiosity replaces judgment, and where there is curiosity, there is space for healing. It is also important to recognize that allowing yourself to feel does not mean being overwhelmed by emotions. It does not mean losing control. It means creating a relationship with your inner experience that is based on respect rather than avoidance. You can feel sadness without becoming consumed by it. You can acknowledge anger without acting on it. You can recognize fear without letting it dictate your actions. This balance comes from practice, from repeatedly choosing to stay present with what arises instead of turning away. Each time you do this, the wound begins to soften. Not because you forced it to heal, but because you stopped making it deeper. Because the truth is, healing is often less about doing something new and more about stopping what is causing harm. And dismissing your inner pain is one of the most subtle forms of harm. It is not loud, it does not draw attention, but it shapes your experience in profound ways. When you stop dismissing what you feel, you begin to repair something that has been quietly damaged over time. You begin to rebuild trust with yourself. You begin to create a space where your experiences are valid, where your feelings are allowed, where your inner world is no longer something to avoid. And in that space, healing naturally unfolds. It does not need to be forced. It does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be allowed, because the wound does not deepen when pain appears. It deepens when pain is ignored, and it begins to close the moment you decide to listen. Something becomes even more subtle now, because once you begin to stop dismissing your pain, once you start listening instead of turning away, a new confusion quietly appears. It is not loud. It does not feel dangerous at first. In fact, it often feels wise, even spiritual. You start hearing words like let go, detach, release, and something inside you tries to follow that path. You try to be peaceful, you try to be understanding, you try not to hold on too tightly, but then something strange happens. The more you try to let go, the more you begin to lose yourself. So the question deepens, are you truly letting go, or are you quietly giving yourself away? Let's step into that difference. There is a form of surrender that brings freedom, and there is a form of surrender that slowly erases you. From the outside, they can look almost identical. Both appear calm, both avoid conflict, both carry a sense of softness. But inside, they are completely different experiences. True letting go feels like release. It feels like a weight has been lifted. There is a quiet sense of space, a feeling that you are no longer gripping something that was never yours to control. The mind softens, the body relaxes, and there is clarity without force. Giving yourself away feels different. It feels like shrinking. It feels like something inside you is being pushed aside to maintain harmony. There is tension beneath the surface, a subtle discomfort that does not fully go away. You may appear peaceful, but inside there is a quiet disconnection. This difference is easy to miss because both can be dressed in the language of spirituality. Many people are taught that being calm means never expressing discomfort, that being loving means always putting others first, and that humility means lowering yourself to keep others comfortable. But these ideas, when misunderstood, create a pattern of self-erasure. Letting go, in the Buddhist sense, is about releasing attachment. It is about no longer clinging to outcomes, identities, or expectations that create suffering. It is not about abandoning your truth. It is not about ignoring your needs. It is not about becoming invisible. When you let go of attachment, you are still present. You are still aware of what you feel. You are still connected to your experience. The difference is that you are no longer trying to control everything around you. You are not gripping, but you are not disappearing either. Giving yourself away, on the other hand, happens when you sacrifice your inner reality to maintain external peace. It happens when you silence your voice to avoid discomfort. It happens when you override your boundaries to be accepted or approved. At first, this can feel like the right thing to do. It can feel like maturity, like kindness, like strength. But over time, it creates a growing distance between who you are and how you live. That distance becomes a source of quiet suffering. You may find yourself agreeing when you do not agree, staying when you want to leave, giving when you feel empty. These actions are not coming from genuine compassion. They are coming from a learned belief that your needs are less important. This belief is often reinforced by cultural and social expectations. Many people are praised for being selfless, for putting others first, for enduring discomfort without complaint. These traits are seen as virtues, but when taken too far, they become harmful, because compassion that excludes yourself is incomplete. Peace that requires your silence is fragile. Humility that demands your disappearance is not wisdom. In Buddhist teachings, there is a deep emphasis on balance. The middle path is not about extremes. It is not about clinging tightly, and it is not about letting everything fall apart. It is about awareness, about responding to life with clarity rather than reacting from fear or conditioning. When you are truly letting go, you are aware of what you are releasing. You see the attachment clearly, and you choose to loosen your grip because you understand that holding on creates suffering. When you are giving yourself away, there is often no such clarity. The action is automatic. It is driven by fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as difficult or selfish. This fear creates a pattern where your inner world becomes secondary. And this pattern is deeply ingrained. It often begins early in life. You may have learned that expressing certain emotions led to negative responses. You may have learned that being agreeable made you more acceptable. You may have learned that your value was tied to how much you could accommodate others. These early experiences shape how you relate to yourself and others. They create a habit of self-adjustment. You begin to monitor your behavior constantly, adjusting your tone, your words, your actions to fit what is expected. This adaptation can become so natural that you no longer notice it. It feels like who you are. But beneath this adaptation, there is a quieter truth, a part of you that knows what you feel, a part of you that senses when something is not aligned, a part of you that wants to be heard, when this part is consistently ignored. In the name of being peaceful or loving, it does not disappear. It becomes distant, and that distance creates a subtle emptiness. You may start to feel like you're living on the surface of your life. Interactions feel less meaningful, decisions feel less clear. There is a sense of being present, but not fully engaged. This is the cost of self-erasure. It is not immediate. It builds over time. And because it happens gradually, it is often difficult to trace back to its source. But the moment you begin to distinguish between letting go and giving yourself away, something shifts. You start to notice the difference in how each one feels. You notice that true letting go brings relief, while self-erasure brings tension. You notice that true surrender allows you to remain connected to yourself, while giving yourself away creates disconnection. This awareness becomes a guide. It helps you navigate situations with greater clarity. When you feel the urge to step back, you can ask yourself what you are actually doing. Are you releasing something that no longer serves you, or are you abandoning something that matters? This question creates a pause, and in that pause, there is space to choose differently. You may begin to recognize moments where you previously would have stayed silent, and instead you feel a gentle pull to speak honestly. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but clearly. You may notice situations where you would have agreed automatically, and instead you feel a quiet resistance that asks to be respected. You may find yourself setting small boundaries, not as a way to push others away, but as a way to stay connected to yourself. These changes may seem small, but they are significant because they represent a shift from unconscious patterns to conscious choices. They represent a return to your own experience. This return is not always easy. There may be discomfort. There may be moments where you feel unsure or even guilty for prioritizing your own truth. These feelings are part of the process. They are signs that you are stepping out of old patterns. Over time, as you continue to honor your inner world, something begins to stabilize. You feel more grounded. You feel less reactive. You feel more aligned with your actions. This alignment creates a different kind of peace, not the fragile peace that depends on avoiding conflict, but a deeper peace that comes from being in harmony with yourself. And this peace does not require you to disappear. It allows you to be fully present. It allows you to engage with others from a place of authenticity rather than obligation. It allows you to give without feeling depleted, to listen without losing your voice, to care without sacrificing your well-being. This is the balance that Buddhist teachings point toward. Not withdrawal, not self-sacrifice, but mindful engagement. A way of being that is both compassionate and grounded. A way of living that honors both yourself and others. As this understanding deepens, you may begin to see past experiences differently. Moments where you thought you were being strong may reveal themselves as moments of self-abandonment. Situations where you believed you were letting go may show signs of self-erasure. This realization can bring mixed emotions. There may be regret for the times you left yourself behind. There may be sadness for the parts of you that were not heard. But there is also clarity, and clarity brings freedom, because once you see the difference, you are no longer trapped in confusion. You can begin to make choices that reflect your true needs and values. You can begin to let go in a way that feels genuine rather than forced. You can begin to stay with yourself even when it feels unfamiliar. This is not about becoming rigid or defensive. It is about becoming aware. Aware of what you feel, aware of what you need, aware of how you respond. And from that awareness, a new way of relating to yourself and others begins to emerge. A way that does not require you to disappear in order to be accepted. A way that does not confuse silence with peace or sacrifice with love. A way that allows you to be both present and whole. Because true surrender is not the loss of self, it is the release of what keeps you from being fully yourself. And when you begin to live from that place, something changes quietly but profoundly. You are no longer choosing between peace and truth. You are no longer forced to decide between being kind and being honest. You begin to realize that these things can exist together, that you can be gentle without being invisible, that you can be understanding without abandoning your needs, that you can let go without losing yourself. And in that realization, healing continues to unfold, not as a distant goal, but as a present experience. One moment at a time, one choice at a time, until the line between letting go and staying true becomes clear. And you no longer have to question whether you are giving yourself away, because you are already home within yourself. Something becomes even more revealing now. Because once you begin to understand the difference between letting go and losing yourself, another pattern starts to show itself quietly in the background. It does not look like surrender. It does not look like peace. In fact, it often looks like connection, like belonging, like being accepted. But underneath it, something else is happening. A subtle shift where your sense of self begins to depend on how others see you. And without noticing, you begin to shape yourself around their approval. So the question deepens again. Are you truly being yourself? Or are you becoming what is most acceptable? Let's step into that awareness. There is a quiet hunger that lives in almost everyone. It is not for food, not for money, not even for success. It is the hunger to be seen, to be accepted, to be valued by others. This hunger is deeply human. It begins early, often before words are fully formed. A child looks for approval in the eyes of those around them. A smile becomes a signal of safety. A frown becomes a signal of danger. From that point on, something begins to take shape. You learn what gets you accepted and what gets you rejected. You learn which parts of yourself are welcomed and which parts are not. And slowly, without being aware of it, you begin to adjust. At first, these adjustments are small. You change your tone, your behavior, your reactions. You begin to present yourself in ways that increase the chances of being liked. This is natural. It helps you navigate social environments. It creates connection. But when this pattern becomes the foundation of your identity, something begins to shift. You stop asking what is true for you and start asking what will be approved. You stop expressing what you feel and start expressing what will be accepted. You stop listening to your inner voice and start listening to external reactions. This is where the craving for approval begins to turn into self-abandonment. It does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, over time, through repetition. Each time you ignore your own truth to gain approval, the pattern strengthens. Each time you silence your real thoughts to avoid disapproval, the distance grows. Each time you reshape yourself to fit expectations, your original form becomes less clear. And the most difficult part is that this often feels rewarding in the moment. Approval brings a sense of relief. It creates a temporary feeling of being safe, being valued, being connected. It can even feel like happiness. But this feeling is not stable because it depends on something outside of you, and what depends on others can change at any moment. This creates a constant need to maintain that approval. You begin to monitor yourself more closely. You become aware of how you are being perceived. You adjust your behavior in real time to keep the response positive. This constant adjustment is exhausting. It requires energy, attention, and effort that could have been used to simply be present. Instead of living from your center, you live from the edges, constantly scanning, constantly adapting. Over time, this creates a quiet tension, a feeling that you are performing rather than being, a sense that you are present but not fully real. This is the cost of seeking approval as a source of self-worth. In Buddhist understanding, attachment is one of the root causes of suffering, and approval can become a powerful form of attachment, not just wanting to be liked, but needing it to feel okay. When approval becomes a need, it begins to control your choices. You may say yes when you want to say no. You may stay silent when you want to speak. You may agree when you feel differently. These actions may seem small, but they carry weight, because each one reinforces the idea that your truth is less important than others' opinions. This is where self-abandonment becomes deeply ingrained, not as a conscious decision, but as a learned response. You begin to prioritize external harmony over internal alignment. You choose being liked over being real. And while this may create smoother interactions, it creates inner conflict, because your inner world does not disappear. Your thoughts, your feelings, your needs remain present, even if they are not expressed. This creates a split, a version of you that is shown to the world, and a version of you that is kept inside. The more this split grows, the more disconnected you feel. You may begin to question who you really are. You may feel unsure about your preferences, your opinions, your direction, because you have spent so much time adjusting to others that your own voice has become quieter. This quieting is not permanent, but it requires attention to reverse. The first step is recognizing the pattern, noticing when your choices are driven by the desire to be approved rather than the intention to be honest. This noticing can be subtle. It may appear as a slight hesitation before speaking, a moment where you feel the urge to change your response, a sense of discomfort when you consider expressing something real. These moments are important. They are signals. They show you where the pattern is active. Instead of reacting immediately, you can begin to pause, to ask yourself what you actually feel, what you actually think, what you actually need. This pause creates space, and in that space, you have the opportunity to choose differently. You may not always choose to express everything openly. There are situations where discretion is appropriate, but the key difference is awareness. When you are aware, your choices are intentional. When you are unaware, your choices are automatic. This shift from automatic to intentional is where change begins. Another important aspect to understand is that the need for approval is often tied to deeper beliefs about self-worth. If you believe that your value comes from how others see you, then their approval becomes essential. But if you begin to recognize that your value is not dependent on external validation, the need for approval starts to loosen. This does not mean you stop caring about others. It means you stop relying on their opinions to define you. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It allows you to engage with others from a place of authenticity rather than dependency. You can still appreciate positive feedback, but it does not become the foundation of your identity. You can still listen to others, but their opinions do not override your own understanding. This balance creates a different kind of connection, one that is based on honesty rather than performance, one that allows you to be seen as you are, rather than as you think you should be. This kind of connection may feel unfamiliar at first, because it requires vulnerability. It requires allowing others to see parts of you that may not always be approved. But it also creates deeper relationships, because real connection happens when there is authenticity. When you are no longer shaping yourself to fit expectations, you give others the opportunity to relate to who you actually are. And while this may not lead to universal approval, it leads to something more meaningful. It leads to genuine connection. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not everyone will respond positively to this shift. Some people may be used to the version of you that adapts and accommodates. When that changes, they may react. This reaction can be uncomfortable. It may trigger the old pattern of seeking approval, but this is where awareness becomes essential. You can notice the urge to return to old behaviors. And instead of acting on it immediately, you can stay with the discomfort. This staying is an act of self-respect. It is a way of reinforcing that your inner experience matters. Over time, as you continue to make choices that align with your truth, something begins to stabilize. Your sense of self becomes clearer. Your decisions feel more grounded. Your interactions feel more genuine. The need for approval does not disappear completely, but it no longer controls you. It becomes one aspect of your experience rather than the driving force behind it. This shift allows you to move through life with more ease, because you are no longer constantly adjusting. You are no longer performing. You are simply being. And in that state, there is a different kind of peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on being liked, but a steady peace that comes from being aligned. This alignment is what supports healing, because it reduces the internal conflict created by self-abandonment. It allows your inner world to be expressed rather than suppressed. It creates a sense of integrity, and integrity brings stability. As this process continues, you may begin to notice a change in how you relate to approval itself. It becomes less urgent, less necessary. You may still appreciate it, but you no longer chase it. You no longer shape your entire experience around it. This freedom is significant, because it allows you to make choices based on what is true rather than what is expected. It allows you to stay connected to yourself, even in the presence of others. And this connection is what prevents self-abandonment. Because when you are aware of your inner experience and willing to honor it, you are no longer leaving yourself behind. You are present, fully present. And from that presence, a different way of living begins to unfold. One where approval is not the goal, but a byproduct. One where connection is not based on performance, but on authenticity. One where your sense of self is not shaped by others, but grounded within you. And in that shift, healing continues, not as a distant idea, but as a lived experience. One moment at a time, one choice at a time, until the need to be liked no longer outweighs the need to be real, and you remain with yourself, even in a world that constantly invites you to become someone else. Something becomes even more personal now. Because once you begin to loosen the need for approval, once you stop shaping yourself just to be accepted, another pattern starts to reveal itself more clearly. It is not about others anymore. It is about the moments where you override yourself, even when no one is asking. You, too. A quiet habit where you say yes, not because you want to, but because something inside you has learned to ignore the no. So the question deepens again. What happens when you keep moving forward, while something inside you is asking you to stop? Let's step into that awareness. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix. It is not just physical tiredness. It is deeper. It feels like something inside you has been stretched too far for too long, like a quiet part of you has been speaking but never heard. This exhaustion often comes from a pattern so common that it rarely gets questioned. The pattern of saying yes when everything inside is saying no. At first, it does not seem serious. It can even feel like the right thing to do. You agree to something you do not fully have the energy for. You take on a responsibility even when you are already overwhelmed. You show up for others while quietly neglecting yourself. Each moment feels small, manageable, temporary. But the body notices, the mind notices, the heart notices. And over time, something begins to wear down. The body starts to send signals, a heaviness that lingers longer than usual, a tightness that does not easily go away, a fatigue that keeps returning no matter how much you rest. The mind begins to feel scattered. Focus becomes harder, decisions feel heavier. There is a constant background noise of tension that does not fully disappear. The heart feels it in a different way, a sense of quiet frustration, a feeling of being unseen, even by yourself, a subtle sadness that appears without a clear reason. All of these are signs of the same pattern, constant self-override. It is not loud. It does not demand attention. It works quietly, beneath the surface, shaping your experience one small decision at a time. Each time you ignore your limits, you send a message inward, that your boundaries are not important, that your capacity does not matter, that your inner voice can be set aside. This message does not disappear, it accumulates, and eventually it becomes a belief that your role is to keep going, no matter what. A belief that rest is something to be earned, not something to be honored. A belief that your needs are secondary. This belief creates a cycle that is difficult to break, because the more you override yourself, the less you recognize when it is happening. It becomes automatic. You say yes before you even feel the no. You commit before you check your energy. You move forward before you pause. And because this pattern is so familiar, it feels normal. But normal does not mean sustainable. The body, in particular, has limits. It can adapt for a while. It can compensate. It can push through. But eventually, it begins to resist. This resistance is not failure. It is protection. When the body slows down, when it feels heavy, when it struggles to keep up, it is not trying to hold you back. It is trying to get your attention. It is asking you to notice what has been ignored. The same is true for the mind. When thoughts become overwhelming, when focus disappears, when everything feels like too much, it is often a sign that the system has been under pressure for too long. The mind cannot process clearly when it is constantly being pushed beyond its limits. And the heart, the emotional center, carries its own form of resistance. It may show up as irritability, as sudden frustration, as a feeling of wanting to withdraw. It may appear as a lack of motivation, a sense of disconnection from things that once felt meaningful. These are not random changes. They are responses. Responses to being consistently overridden. In Buddhist understanding, awareness of the present moment includes awareness of the body, the mind, and the emotional state. When these aspects are ignored, imbalance occurs, not as punishment, but as a natural result. Harmony requires attention, and self-override disrupts that harmony. It creates a gap between what is happening inside and how you respond. The longer this gap remains, the more tension builds. Because something inside you is always trying to communicate. It does not stop just because it is ignored. It continues in different ways until it is finally acknowledged. This is why many people reach a point where they feel burnt out without fully understanding why. It is not just the workload. It is not just the responsibilities. It is the constant pattern of ignoring internal signals. The constant decision to keep going instead of checking in. Breaking this pattern begins with a simple but unfamiliar act. Pausing, not after everything is done, not when you have no other choice, but in the moment when a decision is being made. Before you say yes, there is often a brief window, a small space where you can check in with yourself. How does this feel? Do you have the energy for this? Is this something you genuinely want to do? At first, this pause may feel uncomfortable. There may be a sense of urgency to respond quickly, to keep things moving, to avoid disappointing others. But the pause is where change begins, because it interrupts the automatic response. It brings awareness into the process. And with awareness, you have options. You may still choose to say yes, but the difference is that the choice is conscious. It is aligned with your current capacity. It is not a reflex. Other times you may choose differently. You may say no, or not now, or you may ask for more time. These responses can feel unfamiliar, especially if you are used to constant agreement. There may be discomfort. There may be concern about how others will react. But this discomfort is part of the shift. It is the feeling of stepping out of an old pattern. Over time, as you continue to listen to your internal signals, something begins to change. The body feels less strained, the mind feels clearer, the emotional state becomes more stable. This is not because life becomes easier. It is because your relationship with yourself becomes more balanced. You are no longer pushing beyond your limits without awareness. You are working with your capacity rather than against it. This creates a different kind of energy, one that is more sustainable, more steady, more grounded. It also changes how you show up for others. When you are not constantly depleted, you can give more genuinely. Your presence is not forced. Your attention is not divided. You are there, fully. This kind of presence is more valuable than any number of forced yes responses, because it comes from a place of alignment, not obligation. It is important to understand that honoring your limits does not mean withdrawing from life. It means engaging with life in a way that is respectful to your internal state. It means recognizing that your capacity is not infinite, and that ignoring it does not make you stronger. It makes you more disconnected. In Buddhist practice, there is an emphasis on right effort. Not too much, not too little. Effort that is balanced. Effort that supports well-being rather than depletes it. Self-override disrupts this balance. It pushes effort beyond what is sustainable. It creates strain instead of growth. Learning to recognize this difference is essential, because not all effort is beneficial. Some effort moves you forward, some effort wears you down. The key is awareness. Awareness of when you are acting from alignment and when you are acting from habit. Awareness of when your actions support your well-being and when they undermine it. This awareness develops over time. It comes from repeated attention to your internal experience, from listening to your body, from noticing your mental state, from acknowledging your emotional responses. Each time you do this, the connection to yourself strengthens. And as that connection strengthens, the need to override yourself decreases, because you begin to trust what you feel. You begin to respect your limits. You begin to recognize that your inner signals are not obstacles, but guidance. This shift changes everything, because instead of pushing through life, you begin to move with it. Instead of forcing decisions, you begin to respond to what is actually present. Instead of ignoring yourself, you begin to stay with yourself. And in that staying, something important is restored. A sense of trust, a sense of balance, a sense of being in your own life rather than constantly reacting to it. This is the opposite of self-abandonment. It is self-presence. And it grows each time you choose to listen instead of override. Each time you pause instead of rush. Each time you respond instead of react. These moments may seem small, but they are powerful because they change the direction of your experience, from one of constant depletion to one of steady alignment. And as this alignment becomes more consistent, the need to say yes when everything inside says no begins to fade. Not because you force it to stop, but because you are finally listening. Something becomes even more revealing here. Because once you begin to stop overriding yourself, once you start listening to your limits and honoring your inner signals, another layer quietly begins to surface. It is not just about saying yes when you mean no. It is about why saying yes ever felt necessary in the first place. There is often something deeper underneath it, a belief that your value comes from how much you can give, how much you can carry, how much you can be there for others. And without noticing, you begin to measure your worth by how needed you are. So the question shifts again. What happens when being needed starts to feel like the only way to be loved? Let's step into that awareness. There is a kind of fulfillment that comes from helping others. It feels warm, meaningful, connected. Being there for someone, supporting them, showing up when it matters, these are deeply human experiences. They create bonds. They give life a sense of purpose. But there is a subtle line where this natural desire to care begins to turn into something else. A quiet dependency, not on others needing you, but on the feeling that comes from being needed. At first, it feels positive. You are reliable. You are supportive. People turn to you. They trust you. You become someone others can count on. And in that role, there is a sense of identity. A sense that you matter. But over time, this identity can become fragile, because it is built on what you do for others, not on who you are within yourself. This is where the hidden suffering begins. When your value is tied to your usefulness, rest starts to feel uncomfortable. Doing nothing feels wrong. saying no feels like a loss. You may begin to feel uneasy when you are not needed, as if something important is missing. This creates a quiet pressure to remain useful at all times. You start to look for ways to help, even when it is not necessary. You step in quickly, sometimes before others even ask. You offer support even when your own energy is low. And slowly, your life begins to revolve around maintaining that role, the role of the one who is always there, the one who gives, the one who sacrifices. This role can look admirable from the outside, but inside it can feel heavy. Because being needed is not the same as being loved. Being needed depends on what you provide. Being loved exists beyond that. When someone needs you, they rely on what you do for them. When someone loves you, they value who you are, even when you are not doing anything at all. This difference is subtle, but it is important. If your sense of worth comes mainly from being needed, then your identity becomes tied to constant output. You may feel anxious when you are not contributing, when you are not helping, when you are not being of service. This anxiety can push you to overextend yourself, to give more than you have, to remain emotionally available even when you feel drained, to stay in situations where your presence is valued, but your well-being is not considered. Over time, this creates imbalance. You give more than you receive. You support more than you are supported. You listen more than you are heard. And while you may not consciously notice it at first, the body and mind begin to register this imbalance. There is fatigue that builds slowly. There is a quiet resentment that may begin to surface. There is a sense that something is not being returned, even if you cannot clearly define what it is. This is not because giving is wrong. It is because giving without boundaries leads to depletion. And when your worth is tied to giving, boundaries become difficult to maintain. Saying no feels like failure. Stepping back feels like letting others down. Taking time for yourself feels selfish. These beliefs keep the cycle going. You continue to give, not always from genuine willingness, but from a sense of obligation, and this obligation slowly replaces joy. What once felt meaningful begins to feel draining. What once felt like connection begins to feel like responsibility. This is where the suffering deepens, because the act of giving is no longer aligned with your inner state. It becomes a performance rather than a choice. In Buddhist understanding, attachment can take many forms. One of them is attachment to identity. When you identify strongly with being the helper, the supporter, the one who is always needed, that identity becomes something you hold on to. And anything you hold on to tightly creates tension. Because life is constantly changing. There will be moments when you are not needed. There will be times when others do not rely on you in the same way. If your identity is built on being needed, these moments can feel unsettling. You may feel a loss of purpose, a sense of emptiness, a question of who you are without that role. This is not because you have lost something real. It is because your sense of self was tied to something external. And when that external factor changes, the identity feels unstable. This is why returning to your inherent worth is essential. Inherent worth does not depend on what you do. It does not change based on how useful you are. It is not increased by how much you give or decreased by how much you rest. It exists simply because you are. This idea can feel unfamiliar, especially if you have spent a long time measuring your value through your actions. But it is a necessary shift because it allows you to give from a place of fullness rather than from a place of need. When you are grounded in your inherent worth, your actions become expressions rather than proofs. You help because you want to, not because you need to feel valuable. You support others while also supporting yourself. You give without losing yourself in the process. This creates a different kind of balance, one where giving and receiving are both present, one where your energy is respected, one where your presence is sustainable. As this balance develops, something begins to change in how you relate to others. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove your value. You become more comfortable with simply being. You allow others to take responsibility for themselves instead of stepping in immediately. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you care in a way that includes yourself. This inclusion is important, because when you are included in your own care, your relationships become healthier. They are no longer based on dependency. They are based on mutual respect, mutual presence, mutual understanding. You begin to notice who values you beyond what you provide, who listens to you, who supports you, who respects your boundaries. These relationships feel different. They feel lighter, more genuine, because they are not built on constant giving. They are built on connection. At the same time, you may begin to see patterns in relationships that were previously unclear. Situations where you were valued mainly for your usefulness, where your presence was appreciated, but your needs were not considered. Recognizing this can be difficult. There may be a sense of loss, a realization that certain connections were not as balanced as they seemed. But this awareness is part of growth. It allows you to make different choices moving forward, to engage in relationships where you are seen, not just needed, to create connections where your well-being matters. This shift takes time. It requires patience. It requires continued awareness. There may be moments where old patterns resurface, where the urge to overgive appears, where the need to be needed feels strong. These moments are not setbacks. They are opportunities to practice, to notice, to choose differently. Each time you pause and check in with yourself, you strengthen your connection to your own needs. Each time you set a boundary, you reinforce your self-respect. Each time you allow yourself to rest without guilt, you challenge the belief that your worth depends on constant action. These small changes begin to accumulate, and over time, they create a new foundation. One where your value is not dependent on how much you give, one where your presence is enough, one where being loved is not tied to being needed. In this space, something softens. The pressure to constantly perform fades. The need to prove yourself decreases. There is more room to simply exist, to experience life without the constant requirement to justify your place in it. This is where healing continues to unfold, not through dramatic changes, but through quiet shifts in how you see yourself, in how you relate to your own worth, in how you allow yourself to be. Because the truth is, you were never meant to earn your place through exhaustion. You were never meant to prove your value through sacrifice. You were never meant to disappear in order to be appreciated. Your worth was never something to achieve. It was always something to recognize. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, the need to be constantly needed begins to loosen. Not because you stop caring, but because you start including yourself in that care. And in that inclusion, something steady begins to grow. A sense of being that is not dependent on roles. A sense of presence that is not tied to performance. A sense of self that remains, even when you are simply still. And from that place, giving becomes lighter. Connection becomes deeper. And love, real love, begins to feel possible without losing yourself. Something turns even deeper here, because once you begin to see that being needed is not the same as being loved, another quiet truth begins to rise. Beneath the overgiving, beneath the self-sacrifice, beneath the constant emotional availability, there is often an older ache, a more hidden hunger. It is not only the wish to be useful, it is the longing to finally feel safe, to finally feel chosen, to finally feel held in a way life may have failed to offer before. And this is where the next wound reveals itself. The search for someone outside you to become the home you have never fully learned to build within. Let's step into that awareness. There is a part of many people that still waits. It does not always speak loudly. It does not always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it hides behind confidence. Sometimes it hides behind independence. Sometimes it hides behind busyness, success, or the habit of caring for everyone else. But underneath all of that, there can still be a lonely place inside that feels young, unprotected, and unfinished. This is the inner orphan. It is not always created by literal abandonment. A person can grow up in a crowded house and still carry it. A person can receive food, education, and practical care and still feel it. The inner orphan is born whenever the heart learns that its deeper needs are too much, too inconvenient, too unsafe, or too invisible to be fully received. It forms when comfort is inconsistent, when love feels conditional, when attention arrives only after performance, or when pain has to be hidden to keep connection. Over time, this creates a silent conclusion. It says, I must go looking for outside rescue because what I need is not something I can trust to be there within me. That conclusion may never be spoken directly, but it begins shaping the whole direction of a life. A person starts searching. They search through relationships, through friendships, through romance, through teachers, communities, and spiritual paths. They search through achievement, through admiration, through success. They search for someone, something, some place that will finally provide the safety, validation, and belonging they have not yet learned to offer themselves. From the outside, this can look like love. It can look like ambition. It can look like loyalty, devotion, openness, or even deep spirituality. But underneath, there is often a quiet desperation, a hope that this next person will finally make the ache disappear, that this next relationship will heal the fear of being left, that this next approval will settle the old hunger, that this next place will finally feel like home. And for a moment, it can seem to work. When someone chooses you, there is relief. When someone praises you, there is warmth. When someone pays attention, there is temporary grounding. When someone promises to stay, something inside softens. But because the wound itself has not been met at its root, the relief does not last. Soon, fear returns. You begin to worry they will pull away. You begin to watch their tone, their energy, their responses. You become sensitive to distance, silence, or change. Their approval starts to feel like oxygen. Their presence begins to feel like proof that you are safe. And if they become less available, less warm, or less certain, the old ache rises with force. This is the pain of looking outside for an inner refuge. Buddhist wisdom speaks often about craving and attachment, not as moral failures, but as natural patterns of suffering. We cling to what feels good. We reach toward what promises relief. We try to hold tightly to what gives us a sense of identity, safety, or comfort. But what is outside us is always changing. People change, circumstances change, moods shift, seasons move, bodies age, relationships evolve. Nothing external can remain exactly as we want it to be. This does not mean love is false. It does not mean relationships are meaningless. It means they were never meant to carry the full burden of your inner survival. That burden is too heavy for any other human being. No one can permanently regulate all your fear. No one can endlessly prove your worth to you. No one can heal your deepest abandonment wound simply by staying close. Even the most loving person cannot enter the hidden rooms within you and build a home there unless you also learn to enter them. This is where many people become trapped. They do not realize they are asking others to rescue a part of themselves they have not yet turned toward. So they repeat the same cycle in different forms. They become deeply attached too quickly. They feel crushed by ordinary distance. They confuse intensity with safety. They mistake emotional dependence for deep love. They hand over the keys to their stability and then feel shattered when the other person cannot carry what was never truly theirs to carry. The inner orphan does not want a conversation. It wants rescue. It wants immediate reassurance. It wants guarantees. It wants someone to come close enough, stay long enough, and love hard enough to erase the memory of not being fully held. That desire is understandable. It deserves compassion. But it also creates suffering when it quietly governs your life. Because when the search for rescue is unconscious, you do not see clearly. You choose not from grounded discernment, but from hunger. You overlook red flags because attention feels like medicine. You stay in one-sided relationships because partial care feels better than old loneliness. You tolerate inconsistency because the fear of losing the connection feels more painful than the pain of not being fully loved inside it. And this is how abandonment repeats itself. Not always through others leaving, but through the self staying in places where it is not truly safe because the longing to be rescued is so strong. One of the most painful things about this pattern is that it can feel deeply personal. If someone pulls away, the wound quickly says, "It is happening again." If someone disappoints you, the wound says, "Of course." If someone cannot meet a need, the wound says, "I knew I was too much." The current moment becomes fused with older pain. The present is no longer just the present. It becomes a doorway through which every unmet need from the past rushes back in at once. This is why certain endings feel unbearable, why certain silences feel enormous, why a delayed response, a cold tone, or a broken promise can stir panic far greater than the actual moment seems to justify. The pain is not only about what is happening now, it is about what this moment awakens in the deeper layers of the heart. The Buddhist path invites a different response. Not the denial of longing, but the careful observation of it. Not the shaming of attachment, but the understanding of how it forms and what it asks for. The practice begins with seeing clearly, not saying, "I should not feel this," not saying, "I need to be more detached," but asking gently, what is this ache truly reaching for? Very often, it is not the person themselves. It is the feeling you hope the person will give you: safety, worth, belonging, relief, rest, permission to exist without performing. And once that becomes clear, another question appears. Can these qualities be cultivated within, rather than endlessly begged from the changing world outside? This question is not easy, because the inner orphan is skeptical. It does not trust easily. It has often lived through too much inconsistency to believe that inner safety is real. It is used to scanning the outside world for signs of danger and signs of rescue. It is used to interpreting other people as the source of comfort or threat. Turning inward can feel unfamiliar at first, even disappointing. Part of you may say, "But I do not want to soothe myself. I want someone else to finally do it." That feeling is honest. It should not be mocked. It should be witnessed. Yet healing begins when that witness becomes available within you. This is where self-compassion becomes more than a comforting phrase. It becomes a form of reparenting, a form of inner shelter, a way of saying to the frightened parts of yourself, "I see your fear. I understand why you reached so far outside yourself. I understand why you wanted someone to come and save you, but I am here now, and I am learning not to leave when you are hurting." That sentence changes something, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly it interrupts the old pattern. Instead of immediately chasing reassurance outside, you begin to pause. You notice the panic. You feel the urge to text again, to explain more, to cling, to prove, to seek signs. And before acting, you turn toward yourself for one moment longer than you used to. You ask what hurts. You ask what feels threatened. You ask what the younger part of you believes is about to happen. This is not overthinking. This is listening. And what you hear may be very simple. "I'm afraid I will be left. I'm afraid I do not matter. I'm afraid I'm only lovable when someone is focused on me. I'm afraid no one will come if I stop reaching." These fears are not irrational when seen in the light of lived experience. They are survival responses. But they no longer have to run your life without being seen. In Buddhist practice, mindfulness creates space between the feeling and the reaction. That space is sacred. Without it, the wound leads and the whole life follows. With it, awareness becomes possible. You begin to notice that longing rises, peaks and changes. You begin to see that fear tells urgent stories that are not always true. You begin to realize that the body can feel unsafe while the present moment is not actually dangerous. This distinction matters because it helps you respond with care rather than collapse into old patterns. The body plays an important role here. The inner orphan is not just a thought pattern. It lives in the nervous system. It lives in tight breath, restless sleep, a stomach that drops when someone becomes distant, a chest that contracts when attention disappears. This is why healing cannot be only intellectual. You cannot reason a frightened body into peace while continuing to treat it like an emergency every time closeness changes. You have to help the body learn a new experience, a slower breath, a hand over the heart, feet on the floor, warm tea, silence without punishment, rest without guilt, a gentle tone inward instead of an attacking one. These may seem like small things, but they teach the system that safety can be created internally, not only borrowed from someone else's presence. As this practice deepens, relationships start to change. You become less likely to confuse rescue with love. You begin to notice who offers genuine steadiness and who only activates old longing. You feel the difference between being seen and merely being temporarily soothed. You also become less desperate for certainty because your entire inner world is no longer built on external reassurance. This does not make you cold. It does not make you detached in a harsh way. It makes you more available for real love because you are no longer asking another person to become your missing inner foundation. You can meet them more honestly. You can care without collapsing. You can receive love without treating it like life support. You can grieve disappointment without being destroyed by it. That is a profound shift. The search for external rescue often also appears in spiritual life. A person may hope that a teacher, a teaching, a ritual, or even enlightenment itself will erase their pain without requiring them to turn directly toward it. They may search for the perfect path, the perfect wisdom, the perfect spiritual atmosphere that finally makes them feel complete. But even spiritual longing can become another version of the same wound if it is driven by avoidance of the inner work of self-meeting. Buddhism does not offer magic rescue. It offers wakefulness. It asks you to sit with what is here, not as punishment, but as liberation. It points not to a savior who removes your suffering from outside, but to awareness that transforms your relationship to suffering from within. This can feel less dramatic than rescue fantasies, but it is far more stable, because what is built within does not disappear every time life becomes uncertain. There is also grief in this process, deep grief, the grief of realizing how long you waited for someone else to give you what you did not know how to offer yourself. The grief of seeing how many choices were shaped by unspoken hunger. The grief of knowing how tender that younger part of you truly was, and how often it had to survive on crumbs, on signals, on almosts, on hope. This grief is not a setback. It is part of awakening. To weep for the unloved places within is not weakness. It is honesty, and honesty opens the door to tenderness. You begin to stop mocking your own needs. You stop calling yourself needy for longing for safety. You stop shaming yourself for wanting to belong. Instead, you learn to hold those needs with dignity. You say, "Of course I wanted refuge. Of course I looked for home in other people. Of course I hoped someone would finally arrive and stay. But I can begin now to become less foreign to myself." That last part matters deeply, because the inner orphan suffers not only from the absence of perfect love outside, but from the absence of inner companionship. Healing is not becoming emotionally self-sufficient in a cold, isolated sense. It is becoming internally accompanied. It is learning that when fear rises, someone inside will notice. When sorrow rises, someone inside will stay. When shame rises, someone inside will not turn it into punishment. This is what changes the whole pattern. Not becoming unfeeling, not pretending you do not need others. Human beings need connection. That is true. But connection becomes healthier when it is no longer asked to carry the whole weight of your unfinished wounds. then love can be love, not rescue. Friendship can be friendship, not proof of worth. Presence can be nourishing without becoming addictive. At some point, you begin to sense the difference. You no longer reach outward with the same panic. You still want closeness, but the wanting is softer, less desperate, less fused with survival. You can miss someone without disappearing. You can be disappointed without deciding you are unlovable. You can be alone without immediately feeling abandoned by life itself. This is not because the wound never speaks again. It is because when it speaks, it is no longer the only voice in the room. There is now another voice, a steadier one, a wiser one, a kinder one, a voice that has learned through practice to say, I know this hurts. I know this awakens old fear. I know you want someone else to come close and make it all stop. But stay with me for a moment. Breathe with me for a moment. You are not as alone inside yourself as you once were. That is the beginning of inner refuge. And from that refuge, life opens in a different way. Not because pain disappears, but because the need to be rescued no longer rules every choice. You begin to walk through the world less like someone begging to be saved and more like someone slowly becoming a safe place to land. That is one of the deepest forms of healing. Not finding the perfect person to end your fear forever, but becoming less willing to abandon yourself whenever fear appears. Not outsourcing all belonging, but learning to include yourself in it. Not waiting endlessly for rescue, but discovering that the first hand reaching toward the frightened parts of you can be your own. And in that moment, something very old begins to soften. The orphan is still there, but no longer abandoned. The ache is still real, but no longer hidden. The longing is still human, but no longer in charge. What once searched wildly outside begins, slowly, humbly, and truthfully, to come home. Something softens here, but it also becomes more honest. Because once you begin to stop searching for rescue outside, once you begin to sit with your own pain instead of running from it, another quiet truth begins to surface. You start to notice something that may feel uncomfortable at first. You may have learned how to be kind to everyone, except yourself. You may have offered understanding, patience, and care to others again and again. Yet when it comes to your own suffering, something inside becomes harsh, impatient, or silent. So the question gently turns inward. What happens when compassion flows outward but never returns home? Let's step into that awareness. There is a kind of kindness that looks beautiful from the outside, but feels incomplete within. It shows up in the way you listen to others without judgment, the way you try to understand their pain, the way you make space for their emotions, even when they are difficult. It appears in your willingness to forgive, to support, to stand by people through their struggles. This kind of compassion is real. It is meaningful. It connects you to others and reflects something deeply human. But when this compassion does not include you, something begins to break quietly. Because compassion is not meant to move in only one direction. When it flows outward without returning inward, it becomes unbalanced. And that imbalance begins to show itself in ways that are not always obvious at first. You may find that you are very gentle with others, but extremely critical of yourself. You may offer understanding when someone else makes a mistake, yet when you make one, your response becomes sharp, unforgiving, and immediate. You may tell others that it is okay to feel, that their pain matters, that they should take care of themselves, yet when you feel overwhelmed, you push yourself harder, dismiss your needs, or tell yourself to move on. This contradiction creates tension, because you are living by two different standards, one for others and another for yourself. Over time, this split begins to create a sense of internal pressure. You carry the weight of being compassionate in the world while denying yourself the same care. This can lead to emotional exhaustion that is difficult to understand, because from the outside, it looks like you are simply being a good person. But inside, something feels strained. This is where compassion becomes distorted. not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. True compassion includes all suffering, not just the suffering of others. In Buddhist understanding, compassion is not selective. It is not something you give away while withholding it from yourself. It is a quality of awareness that recognizes pain wherever it appears and responds with care rather than judgment. When you exclude yourself from this response, you create a division. Your own pain becomes something to fix, suppress, or criticize rather than something to understand. This division weakens your connection to yourself, and when that connection weakens, your ability to sustain compassion for others also begins to suffer. At first, it may not be noticeable. You continue to give, to listen, to support, but underneath, there is a gradual depletion. Your energy starts to drop. Your patience becomes thinner. Small frustrations begin to feel heavier. This is not because you care too much, it is because you are caring without being supported internally. Compassion without self-compassion eventually leads to burnout, because you are constantly extending yourself outward without replenishing what is being used. It is like pouring water from a container that is never refilled. At some point, there is nothing left to give. This is why turning compassion inward is not selfish. It is necessary. It is what allows compassion to remain steady rather than collapse under its own weight. Turning inward does not mean withdrawing from others. It means including yourself in the circle of care. It means recognizing that your suffering is not less important, that your struggles are not something to be dismissed, that your pain deserves the same attention you so easily give to others. This shift can feel unfamiliar. You may have been taught that focusing on yourself is self-centered, that your role is to be there for others, that your needs should come later. But this belief often leads to imbalance. Because ignoring your own experience does not make you more compassionate. It makes you more disconnected. And disconnection weakens compassion. When you begin to turn inward, you start to notice how you respond to your own pain. You may see patterns that were previously invisible. The quick judgment, the immediate urge to fix or move on, the discomfort with sitting still and feeling what is actually there. These patterns are not wrong, they are learned, and like all learned patterns, they can be unlearned. The first step is awareness, noticing how you speak to yourself, noticing how you react when something inside feels difficult. Noticing whether you allow yourself the same patience you offer others. This noticing is not about criticism, it is about understanding, because understanding creates space, and space allows change. When you begin to respond to your own pain with curiosity rather than judgment, something shifts. Instead of asking why you feel this way in a harsh tone, you begin to ask what is happening inside you. Instead of trying to immediately solve or eliminate discomfort, you allow it to be present for a moment. This presence is powerful because it interrupts the automatic pattern of self-rejection. It replaces it with self-awareness, and from that awareness, compassion can begin to grow inward. Self-compassion does not mean indulging every feeling or avoiding responsibility. It means relating to your experience with kindness. It means recognizing that pain is part of being human, that mistakes happen. That struggle is not a sign of failure, but a part of life. When you begin to treat yourself with this understanding, your inner environment changes. The constant pressure softens, the harshness reduces. There is more room to breathe. This change also affects how you relate to others. Because when you are not fighting yourself internally, you have more capacity to be present externally. Your compassion becomes more genuine, more grounded, less driven by obligation, and more by connection. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove your kindness. You simply express it. And because it is not coming from a place of depletion, it feels sustainable. This is the balance that allows compassion to remain steady over time. Another important aspect of turning compassion inward is learning to stay with your own experience without immediately escaping it. This can be difficult, especially if you are used to focusing on others. It may feel uncomfortable to sit with your own thoughts and emotions. There may be a tendency to distract yourself, to keep busy, to avoid the inner space. But this space is where healing happens. It is where you begin to understand yourself more deeply, where you begin to see patterns, not just in your actions, but in your reactions, where you begin to recognize the parts of you that need attention. Staying with yourself in this way is an act of compassion. It is a way of saying that your experience matters enough to be witnessed. Over time, this practice builds a stronger connection to your inner world. You become more familiar with your own emotions, more aware of your needs, more capable of responding to yourself with care. This familiarity reduces the sense of confusion and disconnection. It creates a sense of stability, a sense that you are present in your own life. This presence is essential, because without it, compassion becomes something you perform rather than something you live. With it, compassion becomes a natural response, not forced, not strained, but genuine. As this process continues, you may begin to notice a shift in how you experience difficult emotions. They may still arise, but they feel less overwhelming. Not because they are smaller, but because you are no longer resisting them in the same way. You are meeting them with understanding rather than rejection. This reduces the intensity. It allows the emotion to move rather than remain stuck. This movement is part of healing, because emotions are not meant to be permanent. They are meant to be experienced and then released. When they are met with compassion, this process happens more naturally. When they are met with judgment, they tend to linger. This is why self-compassion is so important. It creates the conditions for emotional flow. It allows your inner experience to be processed rather than suppressed. This processing leads to greater clarity. You begin to understand not just what you feel, but why you feel it. This understanding reduces confusion. It helps you respond more effectively. It also strengthens your sense of self. Because you are no longer disconnected from your own experience, you are engaged with it. This engagement builds trust. Trust that you can handle what arises. Trust that you can support yourself through difficulty. Trust that you are not alone in your own life. This trust changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less dependent on external validation, more grounded in your own experience. This grounding supports both your well-being and your relationships. Because when you are stable internally, your interactions with others become more balanced. You are less likely to overextend yourself, less likely to ignore your own needs, more capable of setting boundaries, more able to engage with others without losing yourself. This creates healthier connections, connections that are based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving, connections that allow both people to be seen. This is the natural outcome of balanced compassion. It includes both self and others. It flows in both directions, and because it is balanced, it is sustainable. As you continue to practice this, you may notice moments where the old pattern of self-criticism returns. This is normal. Patterns that have been in place for a long time do not disappear immediately. But now you have awareness, and with awareness you have choice. You can notice the criticism, you can recognize it as a pattern, and you can choose to respond differently, even if it is just for a moment, even if it is just a small shift. These small moments accumulate. They gradually change the way you relate to yourself. They build a new pattern, one that is based on understanding rather than judgment, one that supports rather than undermines. This is how compassion turns inward. Not through force, but through practice, through repeated moments of awareness and response, through choosing kindness even when it feels unfamiliar, through staying with yourself rather than turning away. And as this inward compassion grows, something else becomes clear. You begin to realize that caring for yourself does not take away from your ability to care for others. It enhances it. Because you are no longer running on empty, you are no longer giving from a place of depletion. You are giving from a place of balance. This balance is what allows compassion to remain steady. It prevents it from becoming distorted. It ensures that it remains a source of connection rather than exhaustion. And in this balance, healing continues, not as a distant goal, but as an ongoing process. A process of learning to include yourself in the care you so freely offer to others. A process of recognizing that your suffering matters. A process of responding to that suffering with the same kindness you extend outward. Because in the end, compassion is not complete until it reaches every part of your experience, including you. And when it does, something changes quietly but deeply. You are no longer divided. You are whole, present, and no longer left out of your own care. Something becomes even more confronting here, because once compassion begins to include you, once you start treating your own pain with the same care you offer others, a new awareness starts to rise. You begin to see the places where you have been kind to others, but not honest with yourself. You begin to notice the situations you stayed in, not because they were right, but because leaving felt wrong. And slowly, a difficult question appears. What if staying was never strength, but something you were taught to call strength? Let's step into that awareness. There is a belief that runs quietly through many lives. It says that endurance is always noble, that staying, no matter how painful things become, is a sign of loyalty, of love, of maturity. It says that leaving is weakness, that walking away is failure, that holding on proves character. At first, this belief can feel meaningful. It can feel like a moral compass. It can feel like the right way to live. And in some situations, endurance does have value. There are moments in life where patience matters, where commitment matters, where staying through difficulty allows growth to unfold. But not every situation is meant to be endured. And this is where confusion begins. Because when the idea of endurance is applied without awareness, it turns into something harmful. It becomes a reason to remain in places that slowly break you down. It becomes a justification for tolerating what is not aligned with your well-being. This confusion often comes from how strength is defined. Strength is commonly associated with persistence, with pushing through, with not giving up. But strength is not only about how long you can stay. It is also about knowing when to step away. The difficulty is that stepping away often feels uncomfortable. It can feel like you are betraying something. It can feel like you are letting someone down. It can feel like you are losing something important. These feelings create resistance. They make it easier to stay than to leave. Even when staying is causing harm, this is where the idea of false nobility takes hold. You begin to see your endurance as a virtue, even when it is rooted in fear or conditioning. You tell yourself that you are being patient, when in reality you are avoiding change. You tell yourself that you are being loyal, when in reality you are abandoning your own needs. This pattern is not always obvious. It can appear in relationships where you continue to give despite receiving little in return. It can appear in environments where you remain even though you feel drained or disrespected. It can appear in internal patterns where you continue to hold on to beliefs or identities that no longer serve you. In each case, the same mechanism is at work. You are staying because leaving feels wrong, not because staying is right. The body often recognizes this before the mind does. There is a sense of heaviness that does not lift, a tension that remains even in moments of calm, a quiet fatigue that builds over time. These are signals that something is not aligned. But when the belief in endurance is strong, these signals are often ignored. You may tell yourself that things will improve, that you just need to be more patient, that this is part of growth. And sometimes that is true, but other times it is not. The challenge is learning to tell the difference. In Buddhist understanding, attachment plays a key role in suffering. When you become attached to the idea that you must stay, that you must endure, that you must hold on, it creates tension. Because attachment does not allow for flexibility, it locks you into a single response. But life is not static. Situations change. People change. You change. What was once right may no longer be. And when you do not allow yourself to recognize this, you create conflict. Conflict between what is happening and what you believe should happen. This conflict is often experienced as stress, as confusion, as a feeling of being stuck. You may find yourself going in circles trying to make something work that no longer fits. You may invest more time, more energy, more effort, hoping that persistence will eventually lead to resolution. But sometimes persistence is not the solution. Sometimes it is the continuation of the problem. This is a difficult realization, because it challenges the idea that effort always leads to improvement. It suggests that there are situations where the most skillful action is not to try harder, but to let go. Letting go in this context is not giving up. It is recognizing that something has reached its natural end, that continuing to hold on creates more suffering than release would. This recognition requires honesty. Honesty about what you are experiencing, honesty about what is not working, honesty about the cost of staying. It also requires courage, because leaving often involves uncertainty. It involves stepping into the unknown. It involves facing emotions that have been avoided, but avoiding these emotions does not eliminate them, it prolongs them. When you stay in a situation that causes harm, you are not avoiding pain. You are extending it. And over time, this extension becomes a pattern of choosing familiarity over well-being, a pattern of staying in what is known, even if it is uncomfortable, rather than stepping into what is uncertain. This pattern is reinforced by fear of being alone, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of regret, fear of what others will think. These fears are powerful. They can make staying feel safer than leaving, even when staying is clearly not supportive. This is why awareness is essential, because without awareness, fear drives decisions. With awareness, you can see fear for what it is, a response, not a command. You can feel it without letting it control you. You can acknowledge it without obeying it. This creates space to consider alternatives, space to question assumptions, space to explore what is actually true in the present moment. In that space, a different kind of strength begins to emerge, not the strength of endurance, but the strength of clarity, the strength to see when something is no longer aligned, the strength to accept that reality, the strength to respond accordingly. This strength is quieter. It does not seek recognition. It does not prove itself through suffering. It simply acts in alignment with what is real. This alignment reduces conflict, because you are no longer forcing yourself to stay in something that does not fit. You are allowing yourself to move in a direction that supports your well-being. This movement may be gradual. It may involve small steps, small adjustments, small shifts in how you relate to the situation. It does not have to be immediate or dramatic. What matters is the direction, the willingness to move toward what is supportive rather than remaining in what is harmful. As this willingness develops, you may begin to see past experiences differently. You may recognize times when you stayed longer than you needed to, times when you endured more than was necessary, times when you confused suffering with virtue. This recognition can bring a mix of emotions. There may be regret, there may be sadness, but there is also understanding that you were operating from the beliefs and patterns you had at the time, and that now you have more awareness. This awareness allows you to make different choices moving forward, choices that are not based solely on endurance, choices that consider your well-being, choices that reflect your current understanding. This shift does not mean you will never face difficult situations again. It means you will approach them differently, with more awareness, with more clarity, with a greater ability to distinguish between what is worth staying for and what is not. This distinction is key, because not all difficulty is harmful. Some challenges lead to growth. Some require patience, Some require effort, but others simply drain you. They do not lead anywhere meaningful. They do not improve with time. They do not respond to effort. Recognizing the difference requires attention. Attention to how you feel. Attention to how the situation evolves. Attention to whether there is movement or stagnation. This attention helps you make informed decisions. Decisions that are not based on fear or conditioning. Decisions that reflect your actual experience. As you continue to develop this awareness, the idea of nobility begins to shift. It is no longer tied to how much you can endure. It is tied to how honestly you can live, to how clearly you can see, to how skillfully you can respond. This redefinition of strength changes how you relate to yourself. You no longer feel the need to prove your worth through suffering. You no longer measure your value by how much you can tolerate. Instead, you begin to value alignment. You begin to value clarity. You begin to value the ability to respond to life in a way that supports your well-being. This shift reduces unnecessary suffering. It allows you to move through life with greater ease, not because everything becomes simple, but because you are no longer creating additional difficulty through misalignment. You are no longer holding on to what should be released. And in that release, something opens, a sense of lightness, a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility. Because when you are not weighed down by situations that no longer serve you, you have more space, more energy, more attention. This space can be used to engage with what is meaningful, to build connections that are supportive, to pursue directions that are aligned. This is where healing continues. Not through endurance, but through awareness. Not through holding on, but through letting go. Not through proving strength, but through living truth. And as this understanding deepens, the need to stay in painful situations for the sake of appearing strong begins to fade. You begin to see that true strength is not in how long you can endure. It is in how clearly you can recognize when it is time to move on. And in that recognition, you stop confusing suffering with virtue. You begin to choose differently. And those choices shape a life that is not defined by endurance, but by alignment. A life where you are no longer trapped in situations that require you to abandon yourself. A life where leaving is not failure, but a form of respect for your own well-being, for your own truth, for your own path. And in that respect, something settles. A quiet knowing that you are no longer staying where you are being diminished. That you are no longer calling suffering strength, that you are no longer holding on simply because letting go feels unfamiliar. You are choosing, consciously, clearly, and that choice is what allows healing to continue unfolding. Something becomes even more subtle here, because once you begin to stop calling suffering strength, once you start leaving what no longer supports your well-being, another layer quietly begins to reveal itself. You may step away from painful situations. You may begin to choose differently, and yet, something inside still feels stuck. It is not the environment anymore. It is not the people anymore. It is something you carry within, a story about who you are that has been shaped by everything you have been through. And the question begins to rise, what if the hardest thing to release is not the pain itself, but the identity built around it? Let's step into that awareness. There is a version of you that was formed in moments of hurt. It did not appear all at once. It was shaped slowly, through experiences that left an imprint, rejection that made you question your worth, failure that made you doubt your ability, shame that made you hide parts of yourself, words that stayed longer than they should have, silence that spoke louder than anything else. Over time, these experiences begin to form a pattern, not just in how you feel, but in how you see yourself. You begin to create an identity around them. You may not notice it at first. It does not announce itself clearly. It shows up in quiet thoughts, in assumptions, in the way you interpret situations, in the way you respond to opportunities. It sounds like a voice that says, "This is just who you are." And once that voice settles in, it begins to guide your life. You start to see yourself through the lens of what happened to you. If you were rejected, you begin to see yourself as someone who is not chosen. If you experienced failure, you begin to see yourself as someone who cannot succeed. If you felt shame, you begin to see yourself as someone who needs to hide or be careful. These beliefs become familiar, and familiarity has a powerful effect. Even when something is painful, if it is familiar, it can feel safer than the unknown. This is why people often stay connected to identities that no longer serve them, not because they enjoy them, but because they know them. The mind prefers what it understands, even if it is limiting. It creates a sense of stability, a sense of predictability. But this stability comes at a cost, because when your identity is built on past pain, it shapes your present choices. You may avoid situations that could challenge that identity. You may hold back from opportunities because they do not align with how you see yourself. You may interpret neutral events as confirmation of your existing beliefs. For example, if you believe you are not good enough, you may focus on any small mistake as proof. If you believe you are always overlooked, you may notice every instance where attention is not given. This pattern reinforces the identity. It keeps it in place, and because it feels consistent, it begins to feel true. This is how attachment forms, not to the pain itself, but to the meaning you have created around it. In Buddhist understanding, attachment is not only about physical things or relationships. It also applies to ideas, beliefs, and identities. When you become attached to a certain way of seeing yourself, you begin to hold on to it, even if it causes suffering. Because letting go would mean stepping into something unfamiliar. It would mean questioning what you have believed for a long time. It would mean facing the possibility that the identity you have carried is not complete. This can feel unsettling, because identity provides a sense of structure. It tells you who you are. It helps you navigate the world. But when that structure is built on broken pieces, it limits what is possible. It keeps you within certain boundaries that may no longer be necessary. This is why healing can feel blocked, not because you are not trying, not because you are not aware, but because part of you is still holding on to an identity that does not allow change. You may say you want to grow. You may say you want to move forward. But if your internal sense of self does not support that movement, there will be resistance. This resistance is not always obvious. It may show up as hesitation, as doubt, as a feeling that something is not quite right. It may appear as self-sabotage. Opportunities arise, and instead of stepping into them, you pull back. You find reasons why it will not work. You convince yourself that it is not the right time. These actions are not random. They are consistent with the identity you are holding. Because the mind seeks to maintain coherence, it wants your actions to match your beliefs. So if your belief is that you are not capable, your actions will align with that, even if those actions prevent growth. This is where awareness becomes essential. You begin to notice the patterns, not just in what you do, but in how you think. You observe the assumptions that guide your decisions. You question the stories that feel automatic. This questioning is not about rejecting everything you believe. It is about creating space. Space to consider that your current identity may not be the full picture, that it may be based on past experiences rather than present reality. This realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges what feels stable, but it also opens possibility. If your identity is not fixed, then it can change, not through force, not through pretending, but through understanding. You begin to see that the experiences you went through were real. The pain was real, the impact was real, but the meaning you created from those experiences is not the only possible interpretation. There are other ways to see yourself, ways that are not defined solely by what happened. This shift requires patience because the old identity has been reinforced over time. It has been repeated in thoughts, in actions, in reactions. Changing it is not immediate. It is gradual. It begins with small moments of recognition, moments where you notice a limiting belief and choose not to act on it, moments where you see an opportunity and allow yourself to consider it, moments where you respond differently than you normally would. These moments may seem small, but they are significant because they introduce a new pattern, a pattern that is not bound by the old identity. Over time, these new patterns begin to accumulate. They create a different sense of self, not by replacing the old identity completely, but by expanding it. You begin to see yourself as more than your past experiences, more than your previous limitations, more than the labels you have carried. This expansion creates space for healing, because healing requires movement. It requires the ability to see beyond what has been. When you are attached to a broken identity, that movement is restricted. You remain within the same framework. You repeat the same patterns. You reinforce the same beliefs. Letting go of that attachment allows something new to emerge. It does not erase your past, it integrates it. It allows you to acknowledge what you have been through without being defined by it. This integration is important because it creates balance. You do not deny your experiences. You understand them, and through that understanding you gain perspective that allows you to respond differently, to see situations more clearly, to make choices that are not limited by old beliefs. As this process continues, you may begin to feel a shift in how you relate to yourself. Less rigid, less defined by fixed ideas, more open, more flexible. This flexibility supports growth because it allows you to adapt, to learn, to change, without being constrained by a narrow sense of identity. It also reduces internal conflict because you are no longer trying to fit into a version of yourself that no longer aligns. You are allowing yourself to evolve. This evolution is natural. It is part of being human, but it requires letting go. Not of who you are, but of the belief that who you are is fixed. This is one of the deeper teachings in Buddhism, the concept of non-self, the understanding that identity is not permanent, that it is a collection of experiences, thoughts, and conditions that are constantly changing. When you begin to see this, your attachment to a fixed identity loosens. You become less rigid, less attached to labels, more open to possibility. This openness creates freedom, freedom to explore, freedom to grow, freedom to redefine what is possible for you. And in that freedom, healing becomes more accessible. Because you are no longer constrained by the past. You are no longer limited by old interpretations. You are able to move forward, step by step, with awareness, with clarity, with a sense that who you are is not something that has already been decided, but something that is still unfolding. And in that unfolding, the identity built from rejection, shame, or failure begins to lose its hold, not because it is forced out, but because it is no longer the only story you believe. You begin to see yourself in a wider way, a way that includes growth, possibility, change. And as that perspective deepens, something shifts quietly but powerfully. You are no longer holding on to a broken identity as if it defines you. You are allowing yourself to become something more, something not limited by what has happened, something shaped by awareness rather than attachment. And in that shift, healing continues to unfold, not as a distant goal, but as a natural result of seeing yourself more clearly and allowing that clarity to guide your life. Something becomes even more delicate here, because once you begin to loosen your attachment to a broken identity, once you start seeing that you are more than what happened to you, another layer quietly comes into view. It is not just about who you think you are, it is about how you are seen. A quiet fear begins to surface, not the fear of failure, not the fear of loss, but the fear of disappointing others. And this fear can shape your life in ways that are easy to miss. So the question deepens again. What do you give up when you are trying so hard not to let anyone down? Let's step into that awareness. There is a moment that happens quickly, almost too quickly to notice. Someone asks something of you. A request, a favor, a decision. And before your body has time to fully respond, before your mind has time to consider what is true for you, something inside moves ahead of you. You say yes. Not because you are sure, not because you want to, but because saying no feels heavier than carrying what was asked. This moment may seem small, but it reveals something important. The fear of disappointing others is not just about being kind or cooperative. It is often rooted in a deeper concern about how you will be perceived. You may worry that saying no will make you seem difficult. You may fear that setting a boundary will make you appear selfish. You may believe that expressing your true feelings will make you seem ungrateful or unloving. These fears do not always come from the present moment. They are often shaped by past experiences. Moments where being honest led to conflict. Moments where your needs were dismissed. Moments where approval was given only when you behaved in a certain way. Over time, these experiences create a pattern of adjusting yourself to maintain harmony, a pattern of prioritizing how others feel about you over how you feel within yourself. At first, this pattern may feel useful. It helps you avoid conflict. It keeps interactions smooth. It creates a sense of acceptance. But over time, it comes with a cost. Because each time you choose not to disappoint someone else, you may be disappointing yourself. This is the quiet trade that happens. External harmony in exchange for internal disconnection. And the more often this trade is made, the more familiar it becomes. You begin to anticipate what others want before they even ask. You shape your responses based on what will be received well. You avoid saying things that might create tension. This constant adjustment creates a version of you that is easier to accept. But it also creates distance from who you actually are. This distance is subtle. It does not feel like a dramatic loss. It feels like a gradual shift, a slight hesitation before speaking, a tendency to soften your opinions, a habit of downplaying your needs. These small adjustments accumulate, and over time they shape your sense of self. You may begin to feel unsure about what you actually want because your focus has been on what others expect. You may feel disconnected from your own preferences because you have been prioritizing external responses. This is how self-abandonment grows. Not through one big decision, but through many small ones. Each time you choose to avoid disappointing someone else, you reinforce the idea that your needs are less important, that your truth is negotiable, that your value is tied to how well you meet expectations. This belief creates pressure to maintain a certain image, pressure to keep others satisfied, pressure to avoid conflict at all costs. This pressure can become exhausting because it requires constant attention. You are always monitoring, always adjusting, always anticipating. This state of constant awareness can lead to fatigue, not just physical but emotional, because you are carrying the responsibility of managing how others perceive you. This responsibility is heavy, and it is not entirely yours to carry. In Buddhist understanding, attachment to approval and fear of rejection are seen as sources of suffering. They create a dependence on external validation. They tie your sense of self to something that is always changing. Other people's opinions are not fixed. They shift based on their own experiences, moods, and perspectives. When your actions are driven by the need to control these opinions, you create instability, because you are trying to manage something that is not fully within your control. This creates anxiety, a constant concern about how you are being seen, a need to adjust in real time, a fear of making a mistake that could change someone's perception of you. This fear limits your ability to be authentic, because authenticity involves risk. It involves expressing what is true for you, even if it may not be received perfectly. It involves allowing yourself to be seen as you are, not just as you are expected to be. This can feel uncomfortable, especially if you are used to maintaining a certain image. But this discomfort is part of growth, because it creates space for a more honest connection, not just with others, but with yourself. When you begin to allow yourself to express your true thoughts and feelings, something shifts. You may notice a sense of relief, a feeling of being more aligned, more present. This alignment reduces internal conflict, because you are no longer holding back parts of yourself. You are allowing them to exist. This does not mean you express everything without consideration. It means you are aware of what you feel and you choose how to respond in a way that respects both yourself and others. This balance is important because it allows you to maintain relationships while also maintaining your sense of self. As you practice this, you may encounter resistance. The old fear may arise. The concern about disappointing others may still be present. This is natural. Patterns that have been in place for a long time do not disappear immediately. But with awareness, you can respond differently. You can notice the fear without letting it dictate your actions. You can feel the discomfort without immediately avoiding it. This creates space to choose responses that are aligned with your truth. Over time, this practice builds confidence, not in the sense of being perfect, but in the sense of trusting yourself, trusting that you can handle the reactions of others, trusting that your worth is not determined by their approval. This trust reduces the need to constantly manage perceptions. It allows you to engage more freely, more honestly, more authentically. This authenticity changes the nature of your relationships. Some connections may become stronger because they are based on genuine interaction. Others may shift because they were based on a version of you that was not fully real. This shift can be challenging, but it is also clarifying. It shows you which relationships support your true self and which ones rely on your adjustment. As this clarity develops, the fear of disappointing others begins to lose its intensity, not because it disappears completely, but because it is no longer the primary driver of your decisions. You begin to value your own alignment more. You begin to see that disappointing someone does not necessarily mean doing something wrong. It may simply mean that your needs and their expectations do not match, and that is part of life. Accepting this reduces pressure. It allows you to make choices based on what is true for you, rather than what is expected. This does not mean you become indifferent to others. It means you include yourself in the equation. You consider both your needs and theirs. You respond with awareness rather than fear. This creates a different kind of interaction, one that is balanced, one that respects both sides. And this balance supports your well-being, because you are no longer sacrificing your internal state to maintain external harmony. You are creating harmony that includes you. This is the shift, from self-abandonment to self-presence, from fear-driven responses to awareness-driven choices. And as this shift continues, something changes quietly but deeply. You feel more grounded, more stable, more connected to yourself. This connection reduces the need to constantly seek approval. It allows you to engage with others from a place of authenticity rather than from a place of fear. And in that engagement, relationships become more meaningful, more real, because they are based on who you are, not who you think you need to be. This is where healing continues, not through avoiding disappointment, but through learning to stay with yourself even when disappointment is possible. Because in doing so, you are no longer losing yourself to maintain connection. You are maintaining connection without losing yourself, and that is a form of strength, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, a strength that comes from being aligned with your truth and allowing that truth to guide your actions. Even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it challenges old patterns, even when it requires you to be seen in a different way. Because in the end, the cost of losing yourself is greater than the cost of disappointing others. And once you see that clearly, your choices begin to change. You begin to choose yourself, not against others, but alongside them. And in that choice, something settles. A quiet sense of being present in your own life, no longer shaped entirely by fear, but guided by awareness. And in that awareness, healing continues to unfold. Something becomes quieter here, but also more serious. Because once you begin to stop losing yourself just to avoid disappointing others, once you start choosing honesty over approval, another experience begins to show itself in a different way. It is not loud like fear. It is not heavy like guilt. It is something more subtle, a feeling of nothing. And that absence can be more confusing than pain itself. So the question deepens again. What does it mean when you no longer feel what you used to feel? Let's step into that awareness. There is a state many people reach without realizing how they got there. It does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, quietly, over time. At first, there is pain, there is frustration, there is sadness, anger, confusion. Emotions rise, sometimes strongly, sometimes in small waves. But when those emotions are repeatedly ignored, dismissed or pushed aside, something begins to change. The intensity starts to fade. The reactions become weaker. The highs feel less exciting. The lows feel less sharp. And eventually, something settles into a kind of flatness. This flatness is often mistaken for peace, because there is less conflict, less emotional noise, less visible struggle. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. The absence of feeling is not always the presence of calm. Sometimes it is the result of long-term disconnection. This is what emotional numbness can be. Not the end of pain, but the result of pain that was never fully processed. When you ignore your feelings consistently, the system adapts. It learns that expressing emotion is not useful. It learns that vulnerability is not safe. It learns that reacting does not lead to understanding. So it begins to shut down those responses. Not completely, but enough to reduce the impact. This adaptation is protective. It is the body and mind trying to create stability, trying to prevent overwhelm, trying to maintain function. But protection has a cost, because in reducing pain, it also reduces connection. Connection to your emotions, connection to your experiences, connection to yourself. You may begin to notice that things that once affected you no longer do. Situations that used to bring joy feel neutral. Moments that would have triggered sadness or anger pass without much reaction. At first, this can feel like improvement, like you have become stronger, less reactive, more in control. But over time, a different realization may begin to emerge. It is not that you are in control, it is that you are disconnected. This disconnection can show up in many ways. A lack of motivation, a sense of drifting through the day, a feeling that things do not matter as much as they used to. You may find it difficult to connect with others on a deeper level. Conversations feel surface level, emotions feel distant. Even your own thoughts may feel less engaging. This is not because you have nothing to feel. It is because the pathway to feeling has been reduced. When the self is ignored repeatedly, it does not continue to respond in the same way. It adapts. It becomes quieter, less expressive, more contained. This containment can create a sense of stability, but it also creates limitation. Because emotions are not just about pain, they are also about joy, excitement, curiosity, connection. When the system reduces emotional intensity, it affects all of these experiences, not just the negative ones. This is why numbness can feel empty, because it removes both the highs and the lows. It creates a narrow range of experience, and within that range, life can feel less vivid, less meaningful. This state is often misunderstood. People may think they have moved past their struggles, that they have become unaffected, that they have reached a kind of emotional balance. But balance involves awareness and presence. Numbness involves reduction and distance. The difference is important because it changes how you approach it. If numbness is seen as peace, there is no reason to question it. But if it is recognized as disconnection, it becomes something to understand. not something to fix immediately, but something to gently explore. The first step is awareness. Noticing the absence of feeling without judging it. Recognizing that numbness is a response, not a failure. It developed for a reason. It served a purpose. At some point, it helped you manage something that felt too much. This understanding creates compassion. Instead of trying to force yourself to feel, you begin to approach the experience with curiosity. You ask what has been avoided, what has been pushed aside, what has not been given space. This inquiry is not about finding immediate answers. It is about opening the possibility of reconnection. Reconnection does not happen all at once. It begins in small ways. Through attention to the body, through noticing physical sensations, through observing subtle shifts in mood, the body often holds information that the mind has moved away from, a tightness in the chest, a heaviness in the limbs, a restlessness that has no clear source. These sensations are entry points. They are ways of reconnecting with what is present, even if it is not yet clear. Spending time with these sensations, without trying to change them, begins to rebuild the connection. It signals that your internal experience is worth noticing, that it does not need to be ignored. Over time, this attention can lead to small changes. A slight increase in awareness, a moment where a feeling becomes noticeable, a shift in how you respond to a situation. These moments may be subtle, but they are important because they represent movement from disconnection toward presence. As this process continues, emotions may begin to return, not all at once, not in a controlled way, but gradually. You may notice brief moments of sadness, short bursts of irritation, a sudden sense of joy. These experiences can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because they have been absent for a while. But they are signs of reconnection, signs that the system is becoming more responsive. Allowing these emotions to be present without immediately trying to manage them supports this process. It reinforces the idea that feeling is safe, that it is allowed, that it does not need to be suppressed. This does not mean you will become overwhelmed. It means you are creating space for experience. And within that space, regulation can develop. Regulation is different from suppression. Suppression reduces experience. Regulation allows experience while maintaining stability. This distinction is key because it supports both awareness and function. As you reconnect with your emotions, you may also begin to notice underlying patterns, situations that consistently lead to numbness, moments where you disconnect quickly. These patterns provide information. They show where attention is needed, where something has been consistently overlooked. Understanding these patterns helps you respond more effectively. Instead of reacting automatically, you can choose to stay present a little longer, to observe what is happening, to allow space for experience. This practice builds capacity to feel without becoming overwhelmed, capacity to remain present, capacity to engage with your inner world. This engagement supports healing, because healing requires connection. Connection to what has been ignored, connection to what has been avoided, connection to yourself. Without this connection, change is limited, because there is no awareness of what needs attention. As connection increases, your experience of life may begin to change. Colors may feel more vivid, interactions may feel more meaningful, moments may carry more weight. This is not because external circumstances have changed. It is because your internal engagement has increased. You are more present, more aware, more connected. This presence creates a different quality of experience, one that includes both ease and difficulty, but allows both to be felt. And in that feeling, there is depth that was not available in numbness. This depth supports a fuller life, not one without challenges, but one where those challenges are experienced rather than avoided. And through that experience, understanding develops. Understanding of yourself, of your patterns, of your needs. This understanding allows for more informed choices. choices that support your well-being, choices that reflect your current state, choices that move you toward balance. As this process continues, numbness begins to shift, not because it is forced away, but because it is no longer needed in the same way. The system learns that it can handle experience, that it does not need to shut down to stay stable. This learning takes time. It requires patience, consistency, and compassion, especially compassion, because the parts of you that became numb did so for a reason. They were protecting you. Acknowledging that protection, rather than rejecting it, supports healing. It allows those parts to relax, to open, to re-engage. This re-engagement is not dramatic. It is gradual, but it is meaningful, because it restores something essential: the ability to feel, to connect, to be present. And in that presence, something changes. You are no longer distant from your own experience. You are within it, aware of it, responsive to it. This is where healing deepens, not through avoiding discomfort, but through allowing experience, allowing it to move, allowing it to be understood, allowing it to pass. Because numbness is not the end of feeling. It is a pause, a response to being ignored. And when attention returns, when awareness is restored, that pause begins to shift. It begins to open. And through that opening, connection returns, slowly, gently, but steadily, until you are no longer moving through life without feeling. You are present, engaged, and no longer disconnected from yourself. And in that reconnection, healing continues to unfold. Something becomes even more intimate here, because once feeling begins to return, once numbness slowly gives way to awareness, another truth rises quietly beneath it. You begin to notice not only what you feel, but how you treat what you feel. And that realization can be uncomfortable, because the pain was not only in what happened to you, but in how you continued to respond to yourself afterward. So the question deepens again. What if the harm did not end with the experience, but continued in the way you spoke to yourself every day? Let's step into that awareness. There is a teaching often spoken about with respect and reverence. It is the idea of non-harm, the principle of ahimsa. Most people understand it in one direction. Do not hurt others. Do not act in ways that create suffering for those around you. Be gentle, be mindful, be compassionate in your actions. But this teaching is incomplete when it stops there, because harm is not only something that moves outward, it can move inward just as easily, often more quietly, often more consistently. And the harm done within is rarely questioned. It shows up in the way you speak to yourself when something goes wrong. The tone becomes sharp, unforgiving, immediate. There is no pause, no curiosity, no attempt to understand, only judgment. It shows up in the pressure you place on yourself, the constant push to do more, to be more, to fix everything quickly. Rest becomes something you have to earn. Slowing down feels like failure. There is always another expectation waiting. It shows up in the way you punish yourself for mistakes, replaying moments again and again, holding on to guilt longer than necessary, refusing to let go even when nothing can be changed. These patterns are so common that they often feel normal. But normal does not mean harmless. Each of these responses creates internal tension, a tension that builds over time. Because the mind and body are not separate from the way they are treated. They respond to tone, to pressure, to repetition. When the inner environment is harsh, the system becomes strained. When the inner voice is critical, the sense of safety decreases. And without safety, healing becomes difficult. In Buddhist understanding, non-harm is not limited to physical actions. It includes intention, thought, and speech. And this includes how you relate to yourself. When you speak to yourself with harshness, you create harm. When you push yourself beyond your limits without awareness, you create harm. When you punish yourself instead of understanding yourself, you create harm. This harm is subtle. It does not leave visible marks, but it shapes your internal experience. It influences how you feel, how you think, how you respond. Over time, it becomes part of your baseline, a constant background of pressure, a quiet sense of not being enough, a feeling that you must always be better, faster, stronger. This is not motivation, it is strain, and strain is not sustainable because it requires constant effort to maintain, and it does not create stability, it creates tension. The first step in applying non-harm to the self is awareness. Noticing how you respond to yourself in different situations, paying attention to your internal dialogue, observing the tone, the words, the assumptions. This observation is not about immediate change, it is about understanding, because without understanding, change becomes forced. And forced change often leads to more tension. When you begin to notice the patterns, you may see how automatic they are. A mistake happens and the criticism appears instantly. A task feels difficult and the pressure increases. A moment of rest arises and guilt follows. These responses are learned. They developed over time. They may have been influenced by external voices, by expectations, by experiences where harshness was normalized. But now they are internal, and because they are internal, they can be observed. And what is observed can be changed. This change does not come from rejecting the pattern. It comes from responding differently. When the critical voice appears, instead of accepting it as truth, you can pause. You can notice the tone. You can recognize that it is a pattern, not an absolute. This pause creates space. Space between the thought and the reaction. In that space, a different response becomes possible. You can choose to speak to yourself in a way that is more balanced. Not overly positive, not dismissive, but realistic and kind. Instead of saying you always fail, you can acknowledge that something did not go as planned. Instead of saying you are not good enough, you can recognize that you are learning. This shift in language may seem small, but it has an impact because language shapes perception and perception shapes experience. When your internal language is less harsh, your experience becomes less tense. This does not eliminate challenges, but it changes how you move through them. The same principle applies to pressure. When you notice the urge to push yourself beyond your limits, you can pause. You can ask what is actually needed: more effort or more rest, more action or more clarity. This questioning brings awareness to your actions. It prevents automatic responses. It allows you to choose based on your current state rather than on habit. Over time, this creates balance. Effort becomes more aligned. Rest becomes more accepted. The cycle of constant pressure begins to soften. This softening does not reduce your ability to function. It improves it, because you are no longer working against yourself. You are working with your capacity. Punishment is another area where non-harm is essential. When something goes wrong, the tendency to replay and criticize can be strong. It can feel like accountability, like taking responsibility. But there is a difference between learning and punishing. Learning involves understanding what happened and adjusting. Punishing involves repeating the experience with added negativity. Punishment does not improve performance, it creates fear, and fear reduces clarity. When you respond to mistakes with understanding, you create a different environment, one where growth is possible, one where you can reflect without being overwhelmed. This reflection supports improvement because it is based on awareness rather than fear. Applying non-harm to the self also involves recognizing limits, not as weaknesses, but as realities. Your energy is not infinite. Your attention is not constant. Your capacity changes based on many factors. Ignoring these limits creates strain. Respecting them creates balance. This respect is an act of care. It acknowledges that you are not a machine, that you require rest, space, and recovery. When you begin to honor these needs, your system becomes more stable, more resilient, more capable of handling challenges. This stability supports both your well-being and your effectiveness. Because you are no longer operating under constant pressure, you are functioning within a sustainable range. As this practice continues, you may notice a shift in how you relate to yourself. less conflict, less tension, more understanding, more patience. This shift does not happen all at once. It develops through repeated moments of awareness and response. Each time you choose not to engage in self-harmful patterns, you reinforce a different way of being, a way that is aligned with non-harm. This alignment creates a different internal environment, one that supports healing, one that allows for growth, one that is not based on constant correction, but on steady awareness. This environment affects how you interact with others as well, because when you are less harsh with yourself, you are less likely to project harshness outward. Your interactions become more balanced, more patient, more grounded. This is the broader impact of non-harm. It extends beyond the individual. It influences relationships. It shapes how you engage with the world. But it begins within, with how you speak, how you respond, how you treat your own experience. This is where the teaching becomes real, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice, a practice of noticing, of pausing, of choosing responses that do not create unnecessary suffering. Over time, this practice becomes more natural. The harsh responses become less frequent. The pressure becomes less intense. The need to punish decreases. And in their place, something else develops. A sense of steadiness, a sense of care, a sense that you are not working against yourself. This does not mean you become passive. It means you become aligned with what supports your well-being, aligned with what allows growth, aligned with what reduces unnecessary harm. And in that alignment, healing continues, not through force, not through constant correction, but through the gradual reduction of harm, through the consistent application of awareness, through the willingness to treat yourself with the same care you offer others. Because in the end, non-harm is not complete until it includes you, and when it does, something shifts quietly but deeply. You are no longer the source of your own suffering. You become the support for your own healing. And from that place, everything else begins to change. Something becomes even, more delicate here. Because once you begin to practice non-harm toward yourself, once you start softening the harsh voice within and responding with care instead of pressure, another pattern quietly begins to reveal itself. It is not obvious at first because it often looks like growth. It looks like maturity. It even looks spiritual. You tell yourself you have let it go. You tell yourself you have moved on. You tell yourself you have forgiven. But somewhere beneath that calm surface, something still feels unresolved. So the question deepens again. What if what you call forgiveness is not healing, but a way of avoiding what still hurts? Let's step into that awareness. There is a version of forgiveness that brings freedom. It allows you to release resentment, to loosen the grip of anger, to stop carrying the weight of what someone else has done. This kind of forgiveness feels like space. It feels like a quiet easing in the body, a reduction in tension, a sense that something heavy has been set down. But there is another version of forgiveness that looks similar from the outside, but feels very different within. It happens quickly, almost too quickly, before the pain has been fully felt, before the experience has been understood, before the impact has been acknowledged. In this version, forgiveness becomes a decision rather than a process, a conclusion rather than a journey. You tell yourself it is not worth holding on to. You say they did their best. You remind yourself that anger is not useful. And while these thoughts may be true on some level, they can also be used to move past something too quickly, to step over pain instead of stepping into it. This is where spiritual bypassing begins. It is not intentional. It is not something you choose consciously. It is a pattern, a way of using spiritual ideas to avoid discomfort. Instead of allowing yourself to feel hurt, you jump to understanding. Instead of sitting with anger, you move to acceptance. Instead of acknowledging the impact, you focus on letting go. At first, this can feel like progress, like you are doing the right thing, like you are being wise. But underneath, something remains unprocessed. Because forgiveness that is not rooted in awareness does not fully resolve what happened. It covers it, it softens the surface, but it does not reach the deeper layers. Those layers still hold the experience, the emotions that were not expressed, the thoughts that were not explored, the boundaries that were not recognized. This is why certain situations continue to affect you, even after you believe you have moved on. Something small can trigger a reaction. A memory can bring back a feeling. A similar situation can create discomfort. These responses are not random. They are signals. Signals that something has not been fully integrated. Because true healing requires witnessing. It requires allowing yourself to see clearly what happened, how it affected you, and what it meant for you. This witnessing is not about staying stuck in the past. It is about understanding it. Without this understanding, forgiveness becomes incomplete. It becomes a way of closing a door that still needs to be opened. In Buddhist practice, awareness is central. Not just awareness of the present moment, but awareness of your internal experience. When something causes pain, the first step is not to let go. It is to observe, to notice what arises, to feel what is present, to understand the layers of the experience. This process takes time, because emotions do not always reveal themselves immediately. They may come in waves, they may change over time, they may feel different depending on the context. Allowing this process to unfold creates depth. It allows you to see not just the event, but your response to it, your thoughts, your reactions, your needs. This understanding is what supports genuine forgiveness, because it is based on clarity rather than avoidance. When you skip this step, forgiveness becomes shallow. It removes the visible tension, but it does not resolve the underlying pattern. This can lead to repetition, similar situations appearing again, similar dynamics unfolding, because the original experience was not fully processed. The system has not learned from it, it has only moved past it. Another aspect to consider is the role of boundaries. When forgiveness is used prematurely, boundaries are often overlooked. You may forgive someone without fully recognizing what needs to change, without acknowledging what is acceptable and what is not. This can lead to continued exposure to the same behavior, because the underlying issue was not addressed. Forgiveness does not mean allowing everything. It does not mean removing all limits. It does not mean ignoring the impact of someone's actions. It means releasing the emotional hold, while still maintaining clarity about what is necessary for your well-being. Without this clarity, forgiveness can become a form of self-neglect. You may continue to engage in situations that are not supportive. You may tolerate behavior that does not align with your needs, because you believe that forgiveness requires acceptance of everything. But acceptance does not mean agreement. It means recognizing what is true without denying it. And sometimes what is true requires distance, requires change, requires a different response. Allowing yourself to see this clearly is part of the process. It is part of honoring your experience. It is part of applying non-harm to yourself. Another layer of this pattern involves identity. You may see yourself as someone who is understanding, who does not hold grudges, who moves on quickly. This identity can be positive, but it can also create pressure to respond in a certain way, to forgive quickly, to avoid conflict, to maintain a sense of being above negativity. This pressure can lead to bypassing, because you are trying to fit into an idea of how you should be, rather than responding to what you actually feel. Letting go of this pressure allows for a more authentic response, one that is not driven by expectation but by awareness. It allows you to take the time you need to feel what is present, to understand what happened, without rushing to a conclusion. This does not mean holding on to resentment indefinitely. It means allowing the process to unfold naturally, so that when forgiveness arises, it is genuine, not forced, not assumed, but experienced. As this process continues, you may notice a shift in how you relate to past experiences. They may still be remembered, but they carry less emotional charge, not because they were ignored, but because they were understood. This understanding creates resolution. It integrates the experience. It allows it to become part of your history without dominating your present. This integration is what supports true release, because you are not pushing the experience away. You are including it in a way that no longer creates tension. This is different from suppression. Suppression removes awareness. Integration includes it. And through that inclusion, the experience loses its intensity. This is where forgiveness becomes meaningful, not as a concept, but as a result, a natural outcome of understanding, of witnessing, of allowing. It does not need to be declared. It is felt in the body, in the mind, in the way you respond to similar situations. There is less reactivity, less tension, more space. This space is what allows you to move forward, not by forgetting, but by being no longer held by the past. As you continue to apply this awareness, your relationship with forgiveness changes. It becomes less about doing something and more about allowing something to happen. It becomes less about reaching a conclusion and more about engaging with the process. This shift reduces pressure. It allows you to respond to each situation based on its reality, not based on an idea of what should happen. This responsiveness supports healing, because it aligns with your actual experience, not with an expectation. It also strengthens your connection to yourself, because you are not bypassing your own emotions. You are including them, listening to them, understanding them. This inclusion creates trust. Trust that your experience matters. Trust that you can handle what arises. Trust that you do not need to avoid discomfort to be okay. This trust is essential because it allows you to move through life with more stability, more clarity, more awareness. And from that place, forgiveness becomes something that emerges naturally, when the time is right, when the understanding is complete, when the emotional charge has been processed, not before, not as a way of avoiding, but as a result of engaging fully. And in that engagement, healing continues, not through quick conclusions, but through patient awareness, through allowing each layer to be seen, through giving yourself the time and space to process what has been experienced. Because true release does not come from skipping steps. It comes from moving through them, with attention, with honesty, with care. And when you do, forgiveness becomes what it was always meant to be. Not an escape from pain, but a transformation of it. A transformation that frees you, not by ignoring what happened, but by understanding it deeply enough that it no longer controls your present. And in that freedom, something shifts. You are no longer avoiding your own experience. You are moving through it, fully. And from that place, healing continues to unfold. Something becomes even more revealing here. Because once you begin to see that not all forgiveness is healing, once you start noticing the ways you may have moved too quickly past your own pain, another pattern begins to appear. It is not about one decision. It is not about one moment. It is about a way of being, a quiet habit of adjusting yourself again and again until you can no longer clearly feel where you end and others begin. And the question rises gently but deeply. What happens when you have been adapting for so long that you no longer know what is truly you? Let's step into that awareness. There is a kind of adaptation that helps you move through the world. It allows you to read situations, to understand others, to respond with sensitivity. It is part of connection. It helps you build relationships. It allows you to navigate different environments with ease. But when this adaptation becomes constant, when it moves from conscious adjustment to unconscious habit, something begins to fade, not suddenly, not in a way that is easy to notice, but slowly, quietly, piece by piece. You begin to adjust your tone depending on who you are speaking to. You soften your words in one space, sharpen them in another. You present different versions of yourself depending on what feels safest or most accepted. At first, this may feel like flexibility, like social intelligence, like awareness, but over time the adjustments become automatic. You no longer pause to check what is true for you. You respond based on what is expected. Your personality becomes fluid in a way that is not grounded. Your reactions become shaped by the environment rather than by your own inner state. This is where the loss begins, because when you are constantly adapting, there is no stable reference point, no consistent connection to your own preferences, your own needs, your own voice. Everything becomes relative. You may find yourself agreeing in one conversation and disagreeing in another, not because your perspective has changed, but because the context has. You may notice that your opinions shift depending on who you are with. Not intentionally, but subtly, almost without awareness. This creates a sense of inconsistency, a feeling that you are present, but not fully anchored, that you are participating, but not fully expressing. Over time, this can lead to confusion. You may begin to question what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want, because your responses have been shaped externally for so long. This is the effect of chronic emotional adaptation. It is not about being considerate. It is about losing the connection to your own internal experience. Another way this pattern shows up is in boundaries. When you are used to adapting, boundaries become flexible, not in a healthy way, but in a way that is influenced by external pressure. You may set a boundary in one moment and then adjust it in the next to avoid discomfort. You may feel a limit internally, but override it to maintain harmony. This creates inconsistency, not only for others, but for yourself, because your internal signals are not being followed. They are being negotiated. This negotiation creates tension, because part of you knows what is needed, and another part is trying to adjust that need to fit the situation. This internal conflict can feel draining, because it requires constant evaluation, constant adjustment, constant monitoring. You are not just engaging with the situation, you are managing your response to it in real time. This management takes energy, and over time it leads to fatigue, not just physical fatigue, but emotional fatigue, a sense of being tired without a clear reason, a feeling that interactions require effort rather than providing connection. This is because you are not just being, you are performing. Even if the performance is subtle, even if it is not visible to others, the effort is still there, and it accumulates. Another aspect of this pattern is the way it affects your sense of presence. When you are constantly adjusting, your attention is divided. Part of you is engaged in the moment, and part of you is observing, evaluating, and modifying your response. This division reduces your ability to be fully present, because your focus is not entirely on the experience, it is also on managing yourself within that experience. This can make interactions feel less real, less connected, less satisfying, because you are not fully there. You are partially engaged, partially adjusted. This partial presence affects not only your experience, but also how others relate to you, because authenticity is felt, even if it is not consciously recognized. When you are fully present, there is a sense of ease, a sense of clarity, a sense of real connection. When you are adapting, constantly, that clarity is reduced, and while interactions may still be smooth, they may lack depth, because they are not grounded in a stable sense of self. In Buddhist understanding, awareness of the self is not about holding on to a fixed identity, but it is about being aware of your internal experience, your thoughts, your feelings, your responses. When this awareness is lost, you begin to move through life in a reactive way, responding to external cues rather than internal signals. This reactivity creates instability, because your sense of self is not guiding your actions. The environment is, and the environment is constantly changing. This creates a feeling of being ungrounded, of not having a clear center. This lack of grounding can lead to increased sensitivity. Because when your identity is not stable, external feedback becomes more impactful. A positive response can feel validating, a negative response can feel unsettling. Because your sense of self is not fully established internally, it is influenced by what is happening around you. This creates vulnerability, not in a healthy, open way, but in a way that makes you dependent on external cues. Breaking this pattern begins with awareness, noticing when you are adjusting, noticing how often your responses are influenced by context, noticing where your internal signals are being overridden. This noticing is not about judgment, it is about understanding, because understanding creates the possibility of change. Once you are aware of the pattern, you can begin to introduce small shifts, small moments where you pause before responding, where you check in with yourself. What do I actually think? What do I actually feel? What do I actually want to say? These questions may not have immediate answers, especially if the pattern has been in place for a long time. But asking them creates space for your internal experience to be considered. Instead of immediately adapting, you begin to include yourself in the response. This inclusion is the beginning of reconnection. It allows you to gradually rebuild a sense of self, not as a fixed identity, but as an awareness of your internal state. As this awareness develops, your responses begin to shift, not dramatically, but gradually. You may find yourself expressing a slightly different perspective, holding a boundary a little more firmly, allowing a pause instead of immediately adjusting. These small changes accumulate. They begin to create a different pattern, one where your actions are influenced by both internal and external factors, not just external ones. This balance creates stability, because your sense of self is no longer entirely dependent on the environment. It is supported by your own awareness. Over time, this leads to a stronger sense of presence. You feel more grounded, more consistent, more connected to yourself. This connection reduces the need for constant adaptation, because you trust your internal signals more. You allow them to guide your responses. This does not mean you stop being considerate. It means your consideration includes yourself. You respond to others while also responding to your own needs. This creates a more balanced interaction, one where both sides are represented. This balance supports deeper connection, because authenticity is present. You are not just adjusting to fit. You are engaging as you are. This engagement allows others to relate to you more clearly, because there is consistency, there is clarity, there is a sense of who you are. As this process continues, the sense of loss begins to shift. You may start to feel more defined, not in a rigid way, but in a grounded way. A sense that you know what is true for you, even if you do not express it perfectly, even if it evolves over time. This sense of knowing supports confidence, not in the sense of certainty, but in the sense of trust. Trust in your own experience, trust in your own perception, trust in your ability to respond. This trust reduces the need to constantly monitor and adjust, because you are no longer trying to fit into every situation. You are allowing yourself to be present within it. This presence changes how you experience life. Interactions feel more real, decisions feel more aligned, moments feel more engaging, because you are not divided, you are not managing multiple versions of yourself. You are simply there, with awareness, with clarity, with a connection to your internal state. This is the return of authentic presence. Not something new, but something that was gradually lost through constant adaptation. And as it returns, something settles, a sense of being in your own life, not just moving through it, not just responding to it, but actually experiencing it from within. And in that experience, healing continues, not through dramatic change, but through the gradual restoration of connection to yourself, connection to your truth, connection to your presence, because the loss of self does not happen all at once, and neither does the return. It happens in small moments, moments of awareness, moments of choice, moments where you decide to stay with yourself instead of adjusting away. And each of those moments matters, because they bring you back, little by little, until you are no longer adapting to exist. You are simply existing as you are, present, grounded, and no longer erased by the need to fit. And in that presence, something becomes clear. You have not lost yourself completely. You have only been distant. And now, you are returning. Something becomes even more surprising here. Because once you begin to return to yourself, once you start reclaiming your voice, your presence, your inner truth, another layer quietly reveals itself. It is not about losing yourself anymore. It is not about adjusting to others. It is about how you see yourself. And more importantly, how tightly you are still holding on to that view. Because what if the voice that keeps putting you down is not the absence of ego? What if it is ego, wearing a different face? Let's step into that awareness. There is a common belief that humility looks like lowering yourself, speaking less of your strengths, focusing on your flaws, minimizing your importance. It feels safe, it feels acceptable, it feels like the opposite of arrogance. And so, many people begin to relate to themselves through criticism. They point out their mistakes quickly. They dismiss their achievements. They assume they are less capable, less worthy, less important. This can look like modesty. But beneath it, something else is happening. The self is still at the center, not in praise, but in judgment. Every thought revolves around evaluating yourself. Am I good enough? Did I say the right thing? Why did I do that? I should have done better. These questions may seem like self-awareness, but they are often repetitive, obsessive, focused not on understanding, but on measuring. And measuring keeps the self at the center. In Buddhist understanding, ego is not only about thinking you are better than others. It is about being fixated on the self, constantly referencing it, constantly defining it, constantly protecting or attacking it. So whether the thought says I am superior or I am not enough, the mechanism is the same. Attention is locked onto the self. This is the hidden ego in self-rejection. It feels like humility, but it functions like attachment. Attachment to an idea of who you are, an idea that must be reinforced, even if it is negative. Because consistency feels stable. If you have spent a long time seeing yourself as not enough, that belief becomes familiar. And familiarity creates comfort. Not a pleasant comfort, but a predictable one. It becomes easier to continue believing it than to question it. Because questioning it creates uncertainty. If I am not this, then what am I? This uncertainty can feel unsettling, so the mind holds on to the existing identity, even if it causes suffering. This is how self-hatred can persist. Not because it is true, but because it is stable. It provides a clear definition, a way to understand yourself, even if that understanding is limiting. The problem is that this fixation prevents growth, because growth requires flexibility. It requires the ability to see yourself in new ways, to move beyond fixed definitions. When you are attached to a negative identity, you resist experiences that contradict it. You may dismiss positive feedback, downplay achievements, avoid situations where you could succeed. Because success challenges the existing belief. It creates tension, and the mind prefers consistency over expansion. This is why self-rejection can become a cycle. You think negatively about yourself. You act in ways that align with that belief. You interpret outcomes as confirmation, and the cycle continues. Breaking this cycle requires awareness, not just of the thoughts, but of the structure behind them. Recognizing that the issue is not only what you think about yourself, but how much attention is placed on evaluating yourself at all. This recognition shifts the focus from changing the content of thoughts to changing your relationship with them. Instead of trying to replace negative thoughts with positive ones, you begin to observe the pattern. You notice how often your mind returns to self-evaluation, how quickly it judges, how frequently it measures. This observation creates distance between you and the thought. You begin to see that the thought is not a fixed truth. It is a mental event, something that arises and passes. This is a key insight in Buddhist practice. Thoughts are not permanent. They are not absolute. They are conditioned, influenced by past experiences, habits, and patterns. When you see this clearly, the grip of self-rejection begins to loosen, not because the thoughts disappear immediately, but because you are no longer fully identified with them. You can notice a thought like, "I am not good enough," without immediately believing it. You can recognize it as a familiar pattern, something that has been repeated, something that does not need to define you. This recognition creates space for a different response, not a forced positive statement, but a neutral awareness, a willingness to see what is actually happening without adding extra judgment. This neutral awareness is important because it reduces the intensity of the pattern. It allows thoughts to pass without reinforcing them. Over time, this reduces their frequency and their impact. Another important aspect of this process is understanding that self-hatred is not a form of discipline. It does not improve performance. It does not create growth. It creates fear, and fear limits learning. When you are afraid of making mistakes, you avoid taking risks. When you are constantly criticizing yourself, you reduce your willingness to try. This limits your experience and limits your development. In contrast, a balanced approach to self-awareness supports growth. It allows you to recognize areas for improvement without attaching your identity to them. It allows you to learn from mistakes without being defined by them. This approach is more effective because it is based on understanding rather than judgment. Understanding creates clarity. Judgment creates resistance. Clarity allows you to see what needs to change. Resistance keeps you stuck. As you continue to practice awareness, you may begin to notice a shift in how you relate to yourself. Less focus on evaluation, more focus on observation, less attachment to identity, more openness to change. This shift reduces the intensity of self-rejection because you are no longer reinforcing it through constant attention. You are allowing it to exist without feeding it. This is different from ignoring it. It is acknowledging it without engaging. This approach is subtle but powerful because it changes the underlying pattern. It moves you away from fixation toward flexibility. This flexibility supports a more accurate view of yourself, not overly positive, not overly negative, but balanced, reflecting your actual experience, your strengths, your limitations, your potential. This balanced view is closer to what Buddhist teachings describe as right understanding, seeing things as they are, without distortion, without exaggeration, without fixation. When you see yourself in this way, the need to constantly evaluate decreases because there is less uncertainty, less need to define, less need to prove. You simply observe, respond, and adjust as needed. This reduces internal tension because you are not constantly trying to maintain a certain identity. You are allowing your experience to evolve. This evolution is natural. It reflects the changing nature of life. Nothing is fixed. Everything is in process. When you align with this understanding, your relationship with yourself becomes more fluid, more adaptable, more grounded in reality. This grounding supports well-being because it reduces the pressure to be a certain way. It allows you to respond to situations based on what is needed, rather than based on what you believe you are. This responsiveness is more effective because it is not limited by fixed ideas. It is guided by awareness. As this awareness deepens, the hidden ego in self-rejection becomes more visible. You see how the mind returns to the self again and again, how it evaluates, how it defines, how it reinforces patterns, and with that visibility, you have choice. You can engage with the pattern, or you can observe it. Each time you choose observation, you weaken the pattern. Each time you engage, you reinforce it. This process takes time, because patterns that have been in place for years do not change immediately, but with consistency, the shift happens. Gradually, quietly, you begin to spend less time in self-judgment, more time in presence, less time defining yourself, more time experiencing. This shift changes your relationship with life, because you are no longer focused on who you are supposed to be. You are engaged with what is happening. This engagement creates a different quality of experience, one that is less constrained, more open, more responsive. And in that openness, something changes. You are no longer trapped in the cycle of self-rejection. You are not trying to prove your worth or confirm your lack of it. You are simply present, aware, responsive. And from that place, growth happens naturally, not through force, not through constant evaluation, but through engagement, through experience, through learning. This is the deeper meaning of moving beyond ego, not eliminating the self, but reducing fixation on it, allowing attention to move beyond constant self-reference, toward a broader awareness, one that includes the present moment, the environment, the interaction, the experience. This broader awareness reduces suffering, because it is not centered on maintaining or attacking an identity. It is centered on understanding. And in that understanding, there is space. Space for change, space for growth, space for healing. And as that space expands, something settles, a quiet sense of ease, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer locked in constant self-judgment. You are no longer holding on to a fixed idea of who you are. You are allowing yourself to be in process, and in that process, healing continues to unfold. Not as a goal, but as a natural outcome of awareness, of seeing clearly, of letting go of fixation, and allowing yourself to exist without constant evaluation. And in that shift, something becomes clear. Self-rejection was never humility. It was another form of attachment. And now, you are beginning to release it. You've seen it now, piece by piece. Healing was never about becoming someone new. It was about stopping the quiet ways you've been leaving yourself behind. Every time you ignored your feelings, every time you said yes when your whole being said no, every time you chose approval over truth, every time you called your pain weakness, you moved a little further away from yourself. And yet, the moment you began to notice, the moment you paused, the moment you turned inward instead of running outward, healing had already begun. Not perfectly, not completely, but truthfully, because healing is not loud. It does not announce itself with sudden change. It happens in small, honest moments. Moments where you choose to stay with yourself instead of abandoning yourself again. Moments where you stop calling suffering strength. Moments where you stop confusing silence with peace. Moments where you stop asking the world to give you what you have not yet learned to give yourself. And in those moments, something powerful happens. You begin to return, not to who you were before the pain, but to who you are without all the ways you learned to leave yourself. So now here is the real question. Where have you been abandoning yourself without even realizing it? Drop it in the comments, not for anyone else, but as a quiet act of honesty with yourself. Just one thing, one pattern, one moment. That's how it starts. And if this spoke to something real inside you, subscribe to the channel, because this is not just content. This is a journey back to yourself. Stay with it, stay with yourself.